Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to day two of the U.S. Chamber's third annual Transatlantic Business Works Summit. We're delighted to have you here today. I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors Amazon, Bayer, Citi, Google, Microsoft, and UPS, whose support has made these 2 days possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the Herculean efforts of the Chamber's European Affairs team, Garrett Workman and Kira O'D, as well as our colleagues across the organization who've made these 2 days possible. Yesterday, we had a great set of conversations about digitalization and the green transition, opportunities and challenges for transatlantic cooperation. Today's agenda will pick up on the theme of digitalization and will also bring to the fore three other core issues: supply chain security, health, and challenges from non market economies, including China. Here again, the opportunities and the challenges for transatlantic cooperation. We'll hear from Ambassador Catherine Tai, from European Commission Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, and key stakeholders whose experiences are crucial to informing sound policies that create jobs and promote sustainable, equitable, and durable economic growth. So let's get right to it. As a reminder, audience members can ask questions by typing into the box at the right of your screen. You can also tweet about the event, and we encourage you to do that using hashtag TBW21. Now it's my privilege to introduce Ero Ojiro, who is Director of America's Public Policy at Amazon. She'll introduce our first featured speaker. Ero, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie and Myron and the rest of the Chamber staff for putting together this amazing two-day event. We're very excited to be here. It's extremely encouraging to see US and EU leaders come together to deepen the long-standing transatlantic alliance and tackle together the challenges in front of us, from climate change to digital transformation to post-pandemic economic recovery. As a company that employs more than 1 million workers and supports hundreds of thousands of small and medium-sized businesses in the US and the EU and facilitates billions of dollars in transatlantic trade, Amazon welcomes the creation of the Trade and Technology Council. The TTC has outlined a number of critical work streams that we believe can produce meaningful and tangible outcomes. We strongly support the TTC's objective of facilitating access for small business owners to the digital tools they need and on maintaining free and fair trade so that they can benefit from global commerce. It is my pleasure to introduce today one of the co-chairs of the TTC, Ambassador Catherine Tai, the 19th United States Trade Representative. As a member of the President's Cabinet, Ambassador Tai is the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on trade policy. Prior to her unanimous Senate confirmation, Ambassador Tai spent most of her career in public service focusing on international economic issues. She was also previously the Chief Trade Counsel and Trade Subcommittee Staff Director for the House Ways and Means Committee and Chief Counsel for China Trade Enforcement at USTR, where I became an admirer of hers. She was also instrumental in shepherding the USMCA through Congress and has been a tremendous advocate for US trade policy throughout her whole career. We are so grateful to have her with us today to learn more about the Biden administration's trade priorities. Ambassador Tai, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Arrow for that very kind introduction. It's always nice to be introduced by a friend and a USTR alum. And I want to thank the Chamber for inviting me today and putting together this really important event. Since taking office in March, I've consistently emphasized this administration's commitment to working with Europe to find solutions to the issues that divide us and to collaborate on the opportunities we all see to make trade, and especially transatlantic trade, a tool for achieving shared prosperity. In June, ahead of his first international trip, President Biden stated that the defining question of our time is whether democracies can come together to deliver real results for our people in a rapidly changing world. Today, I'm proud to say we have made tremendous progress answering that question by delivering real results for our citizens. This summer, we reached interim agreements with the EU and the UK to resolve the 17-year-long Boeing Airbus dispute. dispute at the World Trade Organization. Reaching these agreements was important because they protected thousands of aviation jobs on both sides of the Atlantic and suspended tariffs related to this dispute for 5 years. By thinking creatively and working cooperatively, we were able to put our differences aside and reach an agreement that will ensure the long term viability of the American and European aerospace sectors and protect thousands of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic from duties and the effects of non market finance. In resolving this disagreement, the United States and European Union can now turn our attention to addressing the harmful non-market practices in the sector from China that distort the aerospace market and create an uneven playing field for the rest of the world. Building off of that momentum, we intensified talk with the EU on steel and aluminum. And in October, we announced a historic arrangement with the EU that will allow the resumption of duty-free European steel and aluminum into the United States. As of January 1, the EU will suspend its tariffs on American steel and aluminum and its retaliatory tariffs on other American products. This agreement is intended to ensure the long-term viability of the American and European steel and aluminum industries as they compete in the global economy and strengthen the transatlantic relationship between the US and EU. It also provides us the opportunity to place ourselves in a stronger position to address global overcapacity from China and other parts of the world and toughen our enforcement mechanisms to prevent leakage of unfairly traded steel and aluminum into the US market. This deal is also a significant win on a top priority that the United States and the EU share: fighting climate change. As part of the resolution, the US and the EU have committed to negotiate the first ever carbon based arrangement on steel and aluminum trade and create greater incentives for reducing carbon intensity across modes of production of steel and aluminum produced by American and European companies. Finally, in October, we welcomed the announcement of agreements with 4 European partners on digital services tax that unfairly targeted US companies. Austria, France, Italy, and Spain have agreed to remove their digital services taxes upon implementation of Pillar 1 of the OECD International Tax Agreement. With these agreements, USTR, working with the Treasury Department, has put to bed the associated Section 301 investigations and the threat of new tariffs. By resolving all of these trade disputes in our first year, no less, the Biden-Harris administration is showing what we can accomplish when we work with our allies in a collaborative and creative manner. Taken together, these agreements with our transatlantic trading partners have reopened markets and removed or averted the imposition of over $20 billion in tariffs. As we acknowledge our successes in addressing longstanding challenges in our trade relationship with the EU, we must also look to the future. And that is why this summer we announced the creation of the US EU Trade and Technology Council. As you all know, the US and EU TTC co-chairs held their inaugural meeting in Pittsburgh at the end of September. It was an opportunity for us to discuss how we can strengthen our transatlantic economic and trade relationship while tackling pressing technological issues in a way that reflects our shared democratic values. I look forward to continuing this dialogue in 2022 and fully expect that the TTC will demonstrate its capacity to generate concrete outcomes that deepen our trading and investment relationships. This is what President Biden meant when he asked whether democracies can deliver real results for regular people. Our accomplishments in the last year show our commitment to protecting American and European industries, creating jobs, combating climate change, and delivering economic prosperity to our citizens. As we look ahead to 2022, I'm confident that we can continue this momentum and achieve even more. With that, I'll turn things back over to Myron as we explore these topics in greater detail. Thank you.
So first off, I want to echo the congratulations to Marjorie and the team for doing this tremendous forum over 2 days. And of course, Arrow, thank you for the introduction of Ambassador Tai. Ambassador Tai, we have a limited time, so I want to frame it this way. First off, I want to thank you for the good work that you and your leadership have accomplished in removing some of the trade irritants that you discussed. But as you said, there's still a lot of work ahead in the U.S.-EU relationship. And I'm glad you mentioned the important work of the TTC. And you said we want concrete deliverables. What does that look like? A year from now, if you and I are sitting down, Ambassador Tai, what would concrete deliverables be? And what is this platform best suited to address, in your view?
Well, thanks so much for that question, Myron. And I'm going to actually take the liberty of doing a little bit more of a victory lap on all of the things
That's
that we've
all
done
right.
with the Europeans this year. I think it's more than just removing trade irritants, right? That's sort of like, brushing things off. What I really want to emphasize is the degree to which we have changed the posture of US-EU trade. That over the course of the past couple of years, we increasingly found ourselves, and with Boeing Airbus, that's been almost 20 years. But we have often found ourselves at each other's throats in an environment where we are facing much larger, much more significant challenges from economic systems that are just systemically, by nature, very, very different from ours. So, with the large civil aircraft cases, with steel and aluminum, and then also with the creation of the TTC, what we are doing consistently in this relationship with the EU is take ourselves from a posture of locking horns and turning our focus around so that we can join forces, manage our differences, and then take on the bigger challenges and really take them on directly. This relationship has always had a lot of potential. We share so many values, and yet we have spent a lot of time picking at the ways that we're different from each other. I really feel like the significant accomplishment that we've made this year is realigning our postures with the European Union and positioning ourselves to build a partnership, a true partnership when it comes to taking on challenges. In terms of your question on the TTC, there are 10 working groups that have formed across multiple agencies. And these working groups between June, when the TTC was established, and when we had our first meeting of the chairs at the end of September, just in 3 months, had already covered a significant amount of ground. So I have every confidence that all of these groups of experts that we have working together, drawing from reaching out to the stakeholder community, including the business community, are going to be able to build on this position that we have of working together, managing our differences, and then looking at the big challenges and strategically thinking through how we align ourselves to the maximum extent possible, given our different systems, to take on these non-market and non-democratically based challenges that we're facing. So in terms of where we will be a year from now, I think the sky's really the limit. And if this is an invitation, I welcome the opportunity to come back to you and sit down and talk through all of the things that we've accomplished over the course of the week.
Well, there's always that invitation. Ambassador Todd, did you ever see Citizens Kane? A great movie where there's this long table, right? And the husband and wife are sitting at this very long table. And what we want to do is bring the table together. We want to bring you together with the Europeans. But we also know the role of the private sector in driving commerce and driving investment and driving trade. Secretary Romano was here yesterday at this conference, and she was very explicit about some of the concerns we have about EU digital policy.
Yes.
And the way that they impact, in a discriminatory way, potentially U.S. companies. Is this an issue that PTC should take up? Because there are a number of issues, like You mentioned steel that is off the table and the EU privacy shield, but are these the kind of issues that PTC should tackle?
Well, the DSA DMA conversation is one that Secretary Raimondo is a leader in taking on. So, I will defer to her judgment, but yes, these are the types of issues that we have to take on. And to my point again, um, with our closest allies, the expectation is never that we are going to be the same, that we are going to have the exact same interests. The expectation is, and the reason why we're allies, is that we have very similar interests. And that always is going to require us to manage the tensions between us in order for us to keep our eyes on the big picture. So, that's what I would say, which is this structure of the TPC allows for um, the building of an extremely healthy partnership. And that partnership requires us to be talking to each other about the issues that we have to manage between us, but also the issues where we really have to focus on coming together and coordinating our efforts.
Well, if we don't find a way to agree on the standards that should be deployed in the digital era, it's going to be very difficult to deal with third countries like China. So would you look at some tools that are in your toolkit at USTR if Europe doesn't come further along in working with the United States on digital standards? Are there options there?
Do you have specific tools in mind, Myron?
Well, I'm more curious whether you're looking at those options if we don't see Europe and the United States move as forward-looking as we would like to on these
Look,
range of issues.
my focus is always
Um,
on being effective. And so, yes, we have a toolkit that we're very protective of because they are part of what make USTR. We have a reputation for being effective, small, mighty, and accomplishing a lot. In terms of our relationship with the EU, I think that we learn from the experiences that we've been through over the past years, and not just the past 4 years, but the years before then. And we look at, we question ourselves in terms of, given the potential in this relationship, where have we in the past successfully built on that potential, and where have we not? And this USTR in the Biden administration, we really prioritize creativity, out of the box thinking. And to your point about these digital issues with the EU, in terms of the areas where we are not really on the same page and the areas where we need to get to be on the same page, the business sector absolutely has an important role. But I think from our perspective, thinking out of the box, thinking creatively, learning lessons from the past, we know we also have to, as the US government, bring a much more holistic and comprehensive approach. And, in terms of building the stakeholder base and reaching out for expertise and wisdom, we have taken it upon ourselves to not just rely on you, but to build out our base of advisors and our base of stakeholders, to make sure that what we are putting together is something that is smart, wise, sustainable, durable, and
Look, we believe in carrots in the relationship to foster, obviously, forward momentum, but we also need to make sure there's accountability. And this is an area where some accountability from the Europeans is necessary. Let's move on to cooperation with Europe in areas of market distortion, third country issues. So China obviously factors heavily into the dialogue that you have with your counterparts in Europe, and it should. China presents a whole range of challenges, and China is not alone in market distortion, but the industrial policies, the market distortion, the anti-competitive practices that are adopted in China are impacting the world today. And I know you're trying to deal with that. How is this dialogue, the TPC dialogue, going to manage those issues when Europe has still struggles to align themselves completely with us on China policy? There are differences in approaches. But I am encouraged, we all are, that Japan is showing interest as well in participating with the United States and Europe in finding solutions, pragmatic steps forward. What do those solutions look like, and what can be accomplished through the GDC for trilateral discussion?
Well, first of all, let's just take a look at where we are today, right? We have taken significant steps to transform the nature and the tone of our relationship with Europe. And by the way, we've done it without stepping back or being soft on defending our economic interests, right? So, with respect to, for example, large civil aircraft, um, there is still work that we need to do with Europe to manage and to talk to each other around what support will look like for our industries going forward, right? We haven't solved that issue. We have come to a framework that will manage those issues in a more adult and a more mature way, right? But we are also building out a framework for working together on the larger challenge. Same thing with steel and aluminum, right? In terms of that agreement, there is still work that we need to do between us to build trust in securing our markets from unfair trade. In the meantime, we have committed to working together on a framework looking forward at addressing the overcapacity problem, which you're right, isn't just driven by China, but is driven in large part by China in terms of the global market. In the TTC context, for sure, I would say that these are some of the constantly evolving elements and challenges that we are finding in our global economic interconnectivity. The digital transformation is happening to all of us, with all of us, at different paces. It is creating challenges everywhere we look. I think with respect to the relationship with Europe, we are going to take a similar posture here, which is we have to find ways to manage what we are doing and be true to ourselves and our need to defend our economic interests, but always putting that in the larger context of greater threats and greater risks that are outside. I'm really glad that you mentioned Japan as well, because in recent weeks, something else that we've resumed and we've brought a new lens to is the trilateral work between the US, EU, and Japan, looking at non-market challenges and areas where we need to work together. I would say if you look at the relationship with a special focus on the US and EU over the course of the last year, there has been a significant shift. I think that today the US and EU are closer together and better aligned than ever before in terms of taking on some of these challenges. And, I'm really optimistic about uh, how we build on this cooperation given the clear focus that we have right now for why this matters.
Well, Ambassador, I think we agree with you and welcome the progress you've made with Europe to date on some of the outstanding issues that you addressed already a couple of times. But I think the work with to deal with non-market economies like China requires Europe and the United States to take it cooperation to another whole high level. And I don't think we can do it alone. I do think bringing Japan in will be critical. So hopefully, we're going to work with you as partners and support any work you're doing in that area because we do think. Let me talk to you about free trade for a second. Principle of free and fair trade. The administration has not yet signaled its support of moving ahead with an FTA, for example, with the UK, where there's been outstanding. But you sat down recently with the Secretary of Trade from the UK this week. So, what does progress on the UK-US relationship look like right now? Are we going to resume negotiations on a free trade agreement, or are we going to take some other path to enhance and deepen our relationship?
Well, good question. I would say the relationship between the U.S. and UK is one that we continue to build on as well, right? So the large civil aircraft case, something that also required resolution with the UK now that they've split out of the EU. I'll acknowledge that being friends with both the EU and UK, right? Maybe we all have this experience a bit in life. When you have friends who are couples and they split up, right? You have to realign your relationships a little bit, but obviously, the dynamics around Brexit are really highly specific and personal to the EU and the UK, and I want to respect those dynamics. But I would also say that in our conversations with the UK, we also find, right, a lot of shared values, shared systems, a shared language, mostly, with our counterparts in the UK. And it is the same program that we bring, which is in the current environment. We are allies, and we need to figure out how to be allies. In terms of the where we take our trade relationship, we are constantly looking for ways to enhance our relationships with our different partners. And that's right, we do have an FTA negotiation that was started by my predecessor that we've put on pause. But as you'll also see from the many readouts that we put out, right, the conversations have not paused. And we continue to work very closely with the UK on all of the challenges that are ongoing with respect to non-market economic pressures that we're facing, and also with respect to a pandemic which continues to disrupt our global economy. So, the UK hosted the G7 this year. We have, for the first time, a G7 trade track. I really want to compliment both Secretary Truss, now the Foreign Secretary, and also Anne-Marie Trevelyan, now the Secretary of Trade in the UK, for their work leading the G7 trade conversations this year. And you'll see also from that work all of the things that we've been building on with respect to digital principles, commitments to ensure that our trade policies are focused on enforcing prohibitions on forced labor in global supply chains. We will continue to build on this relationship, and I think that we also have a lot of accomplishments to claim over the course of this year.
So no commitment today on an FTA, but a commitment to continue to work with the UK on a range of issues.
Always a commitment to work with the UK.
Is that a fair summary of?
Always a commitment to work with the UK.
Okay, well, we just want you to know from the business community standpoint, we're ready to support the advocacy effort on an FTA if those negotiations resume. The auto group is talking about liberalizing trade in health products, and a lot of our allies are part of the auto group. Why hasn't the United States yet joined that effort? Just quickly, because I'm mindful of the time.
Okay. Is it the specific effort, or why we haven't joined the Ottawa group?
Yeah, the auto group effort.
The specific effort.
On liberalizing trade in health products.
Okay. Well, obviously, we all need to work on resilience in our supply chains, and the health products and medical products coming out of COVID, that is so clear. Clearly a critical area that we all have to figure out how to do this better. Why aren't we a part of this particular, I would say, from my perspective, our focus is on thinking through how we do trade smarter, especially with respect to these critical supply chains. As you know, the administration has an ongoing whole of government supply chain review. We had 4 reports come out earlier this year. There are 6 sectoral reports that are being worked on. Medical products was one of them. I think it was medicines. But I think that from our perspective, there is a lot of nuance and intellectual capital that we need to bring to the conversation. Liberalization may be part of it, but I think that we have pursued a really unfettered liberalization policy for the past many years and decades. And it is part of what has brought us to this current reality of very, very fragile supply chains. And so we're very thoughtful about this. And there's nothing in principle why we are talking to the Ottawa Group and many, many others about supply chains, and in particular with respect to healthcare products.
Ambassador Tai, we'll take up U.S.-China policy at a different time. We'll
sure
take
we
up the World Trade Organization, the reform agenda, how the United States is pursuing that at a different time. But I have one final question. It's the hardest question yet.
Okay, Myron.
President Kennedy opened up this wonderful Kennedy Center in his honor, right? And you were at the Kennedy Center Honors Program on Sunday night with President Biden and many others from the government. What was your single highlight from that night?
Myron, I thought this was going to be an easy question. You have to know that you're asking me to choose a favorite, and that's always going to be hard. Well, you know, when we were in the green room, we were talking about the performances, because I was there because we saw each other there. I have to say that that closeout number with Stevie Wonder.
That was your highlight.
That was my highlight. And I'll tell you why. For those of you who are going to see the program on TV, you probably aren't going to know this, but there was a little bit of a technical snafu, right? And I think that Stevie Wonder, there's some kind of feedback or something with the audio that he wasn't happy with. And so we all sat there, including the president, and everybody there, the speaker, all of the senators, while they worked out the issue. And I'll tell you, I'll bring this back to trade a little bit. And then when they were ready to go, it was flawless, and it was jubilant, and it was wonderful. And what I want to end with is to say that that is the spirit that we are bringing to U.S. trade policy, which is we're not going to be afraid to take the time and to go through the discomfort of getting it right. But our goal is to get this right. And thank you for your partnership, and I thank everyone for tuning in.
Well, Ambassador Tai, one of my highlights was when people talked about America's values. And one of the greater values of America is that we lead from the front. And I encourage you and the administration to lead from the front in all your endeavors on trade and investment, including the work you're doing on the transatlantic front. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for spending time with us. We're grateful for the work you're doing, and we're grateful for the work ahead that we can partner with you on.
Thank you so much.
And with that, I know that I want to turn this over to John Murphy, who will lead a panel discussion on supply chain security and the importance of the United States leading with Europe in dealing with these issues. So thank you very much. Please give Ambassador Tai a round. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is John Murphy. I'm Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to this panel discussion today on the topic of reshoring, friendshoring, and ally shoring, boosting supply chain resilience. Talk of supply chain snarls is pretty much everywhere, even at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Over the course of the pandemic, the media has told us, and some of us have at times experienced shortages and delays in delivery of products for a whole host of goods. Among those that have been affected are toilet paper, N95 masks, pork, eggs, sneakers, semiconductors, automobiles, furniture, lumber, PVC pipe, and according to the New York Times this last weekend, cream cheese. Now, these shortages and shipment delays for goods have been attributed to many causes. Let me just quickly touch on 4 of them. One, this includes pandemic lockdowns as COVID outbreaks affected the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. Most recently, ports in China and manufacturing hubs in Southeast Asia. 2, this also blamed is port congestion, especially in the ports of LA and Long Beach, which are the portal for 40% of U.S. imports. The congestion there has been blamed to one degree or another on factors like a lack of automation, limited business hours, and other factors. Third, there's a severe worker shortage in the United States, as the number of open positions has just topped 11 million. But according to a survey by the Chamber, 35% of the unemployed say they're not even actively looking for work, or not looking for work at all. So this shortage is especially acute in sectors like truck drivers and logistics. And fourth, one of the biggest factors, simply put, is soaring demand. The US fiscal response to the pandemic pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. It's left American families with cash to spend. It's sent poverty to record lows. It's driven retail sales and imports to new records, well above pre-pandemic trends. And this soaring demand has been especially intense for specific products like semiconductors, as well as simpler goods like steel and lumber. So my description is to some degree about the United States, but some of this has certainly affected Europe and other world regions as well. So what's the diagnosis? All of the above, different causes for different products, and most importantly, what is to be done? We have a great panel to dig into these questions. We have Susan Danger, who is the CEO of AmCham EU, that's the American Chamber of Commerce to the European Union. We're joined also by Christian Hoffman, who's head of geopolitics and international relations at Siemens, and Greg Slater, who is vice president of government and regulatory affairs at Intel. Greg, let me start with you. Semiconductors come up more than any other product, perhaps, in these discussions. What's your take on the chip shortage, and how has it come about?
Thank you, John. So the chip shortage is a confluence of factors. First of all, you have an increase in digitization across the board, where new technologies have enabled new applications in the 5G space with AI and so forth that have created this surge in demand. A recent report by Kearney estimates that from 2020 to 2030, we're going to experience a 15% growth in leading edge demand in Europe. And then BCG has had similar statistics where there's going to be an overall increase in demand of 5% in the world for chips. And it's a result of, frankly, an acceleration of everything digital that is separate from COVID. And COVID just aggravated a situation that was already underway, where everything computes and everything communicates. And all these digital devices connect one to another to enable the lifestyle that we're enjoying and the work that we're doing and the ability to educate ourselves through digital means. And so COVID, again, was just an aggravating factor, not really the underlying cause for the chip shortage.
Thank you, Greg, and we'll come back to you in a moment here. But Christian, I'd like to turn to you and get your perspective. Siemens is a German headquartered firm with major global investments, including here in the United States, where it directly employs more than 40,000 Americans. How do you see these supply chain snarls from the perspective of a very transatlantic company?
Thank you, John, for hosting this valuable conversation, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for inviting Siemens to participate. Really appreciate that and look forward to the discussion, and greetings here from Berlin. Before I share my perspectives on supply chains, let me share a quick intro about Siemens today. And Siemens is a technology group that is active in nearly all countries of the world with over 300,000 employees, focusing in the areas of automation, digitalization, the process of manufacturing industries, intelligent infrastructure for buildings and distributed energy systems, smart mobility solutions for railroads, medical technology, and digital healthcare services. Siemens has been an asset in both Europe and North America for nearly 2 centuries and continue to offer solutions to governments and business seeking to improve their operations and efficiencies. As a trusted partner in the transatlantic relationship, we look forward to investment on both continents and providing solutions to the challenge faced the industry in context of the transatlantic relations. United States, for example, we, as you mentioned, we have over 40,000 employees bringing electric vehicle charging stations to meet infrastructure demands, strengthening power grids, delivering U.S.-built locomotives to customers, and bringing digitalization to the manufacturer into reality, investing over $40 billion in the last 15 years in the United States only. So now coming to your question, I believe, John, Greg, you summarized well the status. The pandemic showed really vulnerabilities of global supply chains in 2020 and 2021. In 2022, there's a risk that supply bottlenecks might last longer, and I could run through, of course, several elements on the impacts of supply chains, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'd rather concentrate on solutions. As John mentioned, what can be done. And we need to transform supply chains to make them more diverse, creating a better balance between global and local, or we call it localization. That way, we have a more equitable distribution of investments and jobs, in some cases, creating shorter supply chains, which may have a lower carbon footprint. Speed, transparency, flexibility are key elements to focus when investing in supply chain resilience. And digital technologies can enable manufacturers to improve visibility, to diversify suppliers, and to respond faster to market changes. I'll give you one example. In addition to supporting customers all over the world in producing ventilators in record time during the start of the pandemic, we had also a major contribution fighting against COVID. Our technology has helped the small and medium enterprise company BioNTech to accelerate vaccine development and mass production of the company within just 1 year. So we have the conversion time for existing production facilities down to 5 months, and we want to help ramp up the production. So there's enough vaccine for people everywhere, no matter where they live. And investments in automation and digitalization are essential to strengthen resilience. And the same applies to transparency. And here we're working together with Supply Frame, proactively focused in supply chain risk management practices, working with a strong and diverse supplier network, and increasingly adopting new tools to increase our capabilities to predict through analytics how to reduce risks. And on semiconductors, I appreciate really the insights from Greg. And Siemens particularly engaged in the semiconductor space, from our electronic design automation business to our factory automation to our software support for industry. We have solutions to meet the current and the future needs. And we see in the US a needed investment in legacy fabs built in the 80s and the 90s, and we see longer term investments needed in leading edge technology. So the CHIPS Act, for example, as the promised investment tax credit, will begin to meet these needs and enable diversification of supply chain. So also the Manufacturing USA public-private partnerships will support these developments, includes much needed workforce development, expand research strengths, chip design, advanced packaging, edge computing, sustainability as a major element of this elements I would like really to enforce here today as well. And we believe the Transatlantic relations and the Trade and Technology Council can increase cooperation and capacity across these fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That's interesting points about how automation, among your other points, automation can play a big role in addressing supply chain shortages, not just as a complement to creating new positions and helping address the worker shortage, but enhancing productivity broadly. Susan, let me turn to you. You know the European operations of U.S. multinationals as well as anyone. Do the supply chain problems that we see here in the United States, are they the same in Europe? Are there differences that maybe lend themselves to lessons that can be applied more broadly? I just to give one example that's been on my mind, I recently watched an overview of the Port of Rotterdam and how highly automated it is, and really has a much higher level of productivity than many U.S. ports. So certainly lessons there, but you may have many other thoughts.
Yes, thanks, John. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference, and pass on my regards to Myron and Marjorie as well. And maybe if I may, I'll just a quick introduction, probably speaking to a potentially mostly US audience. I'm Chairman Yu here. We're representing US companies committed to and invested in Europe. And I think it's important to stress that our absolute priorities here related to this topic with regard to trade and supply chains are, one, a strong and united Europe. We strongly believe in the single market. You know, there's the free flow of goods, people, and labor and skills here, and also the transatlantic relationship. And we've been very much focused on the economic recovery at the moment. We remain so. And as referenced by my previous panelists, green and digital, as well as resetting the US relationship. But yes, with regard to your question, John, maybe to give you a little bit of a flavor of the situation, whether any similarities, first of all, with regard to these blockages and some of the ones that you mentioned. Indeed, you know, during it's a lot of it, has been COVID-led during the COVID pandemic. I think two things here. One, yes, we had a lot of problems. What we saw at the beginning were member states, so that's the individual countries here in the EU, acting in rather what you might call an individualistic manner. and uncoordinated fashion, which actually aggravated this blockage in supply chains, causing indeed sort of lack of PPE and other equipment and other goods, amongst others. But I think what it really did show, though, which is very important, was how independent we are and how the supply chains are so interlinked, whether they were here in Europe or whether they were global. And sort of a mindset change happened. And that leads me to the word of cooperation, which fortunately led to then a much greater deal of cooperation, which is still what we need. That coordinated response. We saw the blockages being unlocked. With, for example, green lanes were introduced over here to really speed up the transfer of goods across borders, as well as the pullback on certain export controls, which really were not helping. We didn't have the cream cheese problem, and we still don't have that, John, but we certainly did. I would say yeast is one that stands out. Everyone was doing a lot of baking of bread, so that was definitely a problem. But moving forward, just to stress again the single market here. The single market is absolutely crucial for US business in terms of not only being this free flow of goods, which is so essential, but also being the springboard to the periphery in the rest of the world. Actually, the UK is a classic example of that, showing now that the UK is out of the single market and the impact that that has had on supply chains, whether they be COVID related or Brexit related. We are so interdependent. To produce a car here in Europe, I think a component of a car usually has to cross 40 times across the English Channel before that car is completed. So absolute interdependence here. Now, to really get into your question of automation, indeed, you're seeing here in Europe as well as in the EU, you mentioned that this surge in consumer demand. So many of the same issues now, a lack of truck drivers, demand increasing, so more bottlenecks for many reasons. I would say you mentioned lumber, but yes, everyone is renovating their house at the moment. So there's definitely a lack in that regard. Now, with regard to ports, indeed, I don't think we have had as much of a problem in bottlenecks as ports as you have had in the US, and we've certainly seen those pictures coming over here. Actually, one reason would be the hiring of personnel in the last years, which has increased, but also this automation. You mentioned Rotterdam, which is in the Netherlands, of course, and that is an absolutely great example of automation. They have terminals there which are up to 80% automated now. And with advancements now that allow them to go on working during severe weather conditions as well. So really, indeed, automation. Many countries here are really ahead of the game. I know that you passed an infrastructure bill over in the US recently with $17 billion earmarked, and indeed, hopefully some of that is going to port infrastructure, because we've certainly seen the difference here. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Susan. Very, very good. Greg, let me go back to you as we start to think a bit about solutions a little more deeply. There's a lot of attention right now on legislation to fund the Chips for America Act. Of course, that act was passed by Congress about a year ago, but it hasn't been funded. And this would provide support for semiconductor investment. There's similar efforts afoot in Europe. Sometimes we read a discussion that wants to describe these as kind of a zero-sum game, that countries are chasing after the same investment dollars. But are there ways that the United States and the EU can collaborate on R&D in a way that's mutually beneficial and that can overcome this chip shortage?
Thank you, John. Let me just spend a minute giving a little bit of background so you'll understand my answer more. The US and EU have a common problem, common supply chain problem, and chip shortage resulting from that problem. And it is this decoupling of manufacturing from R&D that's happened, with manufacturing migrating to East Asia because of a more favorable operational environment over there, fueled largely by incentives, but also with other factors. And by the way, the commonality is pretty evident in the data. Europe had a more than 40% share of global semiconductor manufacturing back in 1990. It's now 9%. US had a 37% share. It's now at 12%. So both regions need public and private sector investment to expand not just capacity, but also capability. Once you disconnect the two, both start to suffer. And so they both need to reverse these trends And the only way to do that is through private and public investment in this industry, because the capital expenditures are so high for each, and they're getting higher for each technology. Policy measures to track chip making to the US and the EU should not be misunderstood as a race to the bottom. We have a shared interest in working to rebalance the supply chain, and it's urgent that we do so. And one of the common elements that we have is the need for more R&D, right? Especially pre-competitive R&D. That can be done through an IMEC and a collaboration between IMEC, which has been wildly successful in Europe, in part because of government support, and what's the new National Semiconductor Technology Center that the U.S. CHIPS Act will set up. And there are plenty of R&D gaps that can be filled by this collaboration. Another vehicle in the U.S. CHIPS Act that can be used to promote that is this multilateral security fund, where allies can pool their resources and, among other things, fund pre-competitive R&D, and then have that R&D develop into prototypes, and then that gets commercially developed. In other words, bridging the gap between moving from lab to fab, which is a big deal. So again, there are some common interests here that if public policy and these legislative acts capitalize on, could be beneficial to both continents.
Thanks, Greg. That's a great example of how cooperation can actually work. Christian, turning back to you, one issue that we discussed earlier, you and I, was the workforce shortage. And in the U.S., not only do we see worker shortages, and this applies elsewhere as well to some degree, that are severe, but it's not just as workers, it's shortages of trained and skilled workers. And I know Siemens has been very active on these issues. What kinds of solutions do you see for public policy on the one hand, but also for an individual company, like in your case?
Very good point, John. Really, we live in times of fundamental and accelerated change. Global trends really such as climate change, urbanization, localization, but above all, advancing digitalization presents us with enormous challenges and change our lives profoundly. The pandemic has only exacerbated these challenges in many areas. Above all, however, the pandemic also triggered an additional boost in digitalization, which not only brings new challenges, but also brings about a myriad of opportunities with regards to how we communicate, do business, and work, like our discussion today. While technology advances are expected to displace many jobs in the future, 75 million existing jobs, also emerging tasks and roles are projected to generate upward 130 million jobs. So as we speak, new jobs are being created, other less needed orders being changed. And we must change the mindset. Digitalization and innovation are job engines. But more than ever, we need to develop a growth mindset that helps us embrace change through remaining curious and as well willing to constantly experiment and adapt, building resilience as people, and remaining relevant as skilled professionals. This is the only way to remain sustainably employable over a long professional life. So I start with this important example because, that being said, we had seen important challenges with announcements from and important opportunities as well from the infrastructure bill and EU recovery plans, also within the single market, as you mentioned. These programs are critical to transforming buildings, energy systems, manufacturing base to a more sustainable and resilient future. And as recently emphasized by our CEO in the United States, Barbara Hampton, we need to focus on the most critical component, the people who run these infrastructure systems of the future, and why now is the time to expand career pathways and making them more acceptable. So this, think in terms of careers rather than jobs. I think that's one important element, and the idea of a lifelong learning. At Siemens, we're encouraged from day one. I remember when I started as an intern at Siemens, we have to own our career from day one. And this is a motto that I embed from my activities since I joined the team. In the United States, well, some of the solutions now, we develop technical training pathways and building talent pipelines in more than 100,000 academic institutions nationwide. So the students have access to our technologies, whether or not they end up joining our team at some point. But Siemens has deep roots in apprenticeship and dual learning programs. And in my experience, developing also educational programs abroad from Latin America to Middle East, and also in discussions here in the European level, the challenges are very similar everywhere. I believe here the transatlantic relations should move into partnerships to foster the exchange of students, researchers, professionals to strengthen knowledge and ties. From a curriculum development, train-the-trainer programs, also in many activities for upskilling, reskilling, inclusion programs, there are lots to be done, also in certification. And we should also aim to join programs including partners on the transatlantic aspect, but also including small and medium manufacturers. They are at the front line also of the transformation industry and the need for professionals, as you mentioned. Initiatives that encourage workforce development for the fourth industrial revolution should be central in the transatlantic cooperation. Finally, purpose is also an essential factor. People today, people want to know and have the feeling that the work they do is done well and they can make the world a little bit better. For us at Siemens, so we consider ourselves as a company that drives technology with purpose. And here's a great purpose for us in transforming the everyday with technology that can really reduce the carbon footprint and digital transformation. These are discussions also looking into topics such as sustainability and the role of technology that we've also very much engaged and glad to cooperate as well in this discussion as well, looking into strengthening the workforce development. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christian. That's very useful, and I particularly appreciate your comments about the usefulness of a breadth of experience being more necessary than ever as in workforce training and preparation. Susan, let's turn to the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council. It's meant, at least in part, to prevent the arising of new trade barriers, particularly in areas having to do with technology. How do you assess this new initiative that's just getting underway? And does it hold potential to help address the challenges facing supply chains today?
Yes, thank you, John. And I believe it does. If you just think back to the comments made by the previous panelists about how important digitization is, it's absolutely essential. We're very, very encouraged by it. And I think it also shows, it goes back to the word cooperation again, just the formation of this so quickly shows, gives us a lot of optimism with regard to new cooperation between the EU and the US going forward. I think it brings with it opportunities and pitfalls potentially. The pitfall is, and we just want to make very sure that the TTC does not join the long list, as I believe it was a couple of years ago, the Department of Commerce called it the graveyard of failed initiatives. We don't feel that it's going to end up there, and it mustn't end up there. So we have to all work really hard to make sure it's a success. And very encouraged. I know it's been mentioned numerous times, though, yesterday and today, including from Ambassador Tai just now. It's a real opportunity to start afresh. And what's different to maybe something like the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that unfortunately failed, is that we've got the 10 working groups that have been formed. It's still early days, but there's an openness to doing this in a more piecemeal manner. When we can make progress, we make it. We don't have to wait for everything to be done in one go. I think that is a sure sign of greater success. We, of course, have one working group, which is called Secure Supply Chains and Global Trade Challenges. We're looking forward to contributing to that. I think it's also a great sign that there are so many stakeholder forums being opened up and websites, a lot of opportunity for stakeholders to give input. And in fact, in the input that we gave into the group on supply chains was indeed calling out for our support of ally shoring and friend shoring, which is all about working with allies and those with similar values, or also mentioned earlier. Do know that the supply chain working group, what they have said so far is that their focus will be on indeed semiconductors, as mentioned by my fellow panelists, clean energy, absolutely essential, pharmaceuticals, and critical raw materials. Maybe just to say what we do, one comment about TTC, or rather, before we can make progress on TTC, I think we have to remember that we still need to make progress in some other areas. And I would like to call out the privacy shield. Until we make progress on some of the other trade irritants, the TTC is then less likely to have success. So we've got to find a new agreement for that with regard to data flows. That comes before anything on the TTC. We also need the longer term solutions to steel and aluminium and the civil aircraft dispute. Ambassador Tai referenced that earlier in her remarks. But overall, I think some of the words are about communication, keeping each other informed, sharing, converging, together, the TTC, we can tackle many of the global issues that do exist and which are impacting this free flow of trade and global supply chains. So it's going to help us all build trust as well, John.
And Susan, thank you very much. And your comment about the importance of getting a replacement for Privacy Shield and how important that is, I think, spot on. Yesterday, I was struck at a comment by CJ Mahoney from Microsoft, who said that the TTC will be stillborn if we fail to get a new agreement to succeed Privacy Shield, which is so important, not just for big companies like CJ's with Microsoft. It's even more important for the many small businesses, medium-sized businesses working across the Atlantic. Christian, let's stick with the TTC for a minute. How do you see its potential to foster resilient supply chains? And if I may add just one additional word here, because you raised it the other day, it's cybersecurity. Do you see that as a theme that fits in with the TTC?
Definitely. I mean, Siemens welcomes the decision of the US and the EU to establish a Trade and Technology Council, a very important milestone for the bilateral cooperation in transatlantic cooperation. We see the transatlantic discussion as a critical in addressing supply chain issues, working with partner countries and companies, and identifying the needs and solutions to meet the ever-changing technology landscape. The 10 working groups have the potential to achieve important milestones of the bilateral cooperation. Some areas that we see that the TTC could foster are on the secure supply chains working group, as mentioned. I mean, there are some areas like develop common strategies to secure semiconductor supply chain, including semiconductor equipment, materials, and raw materials, find a common understanding of leading edge semiconductors, and support investments in small and medium-sized companies, especially to drive digital transformation and advanced manufacturing in the overall supply chain. But other working groups can play a big role to strengthen resilience on climate and clean tech. Also referring to we welcome the creation of the EU-US high-level climate action group. Siemens fosters digitalization transformation as a key enabler to reach the climate targets in strength and resilience. And we're strongly focused as a company with targets to become a company carbon neutral by 2030. So our technologies also support customers also to decarbonize, and we're really much engaged with through our sustainability framework degree, really how we can make recommendations and work together from an industrial perspective to support bilateral cooperation, achieve targets of also by 2050 on the cooperation. On technology standards also, I mean, Siemens supports international harmonized standards on different technologies to work together the international standardization roadmaps and technical norms. Give an example, Industry 4.0 from IEC 62443. Those are important examples, but also for technologies such as industrial IoT, also for EV charging, autonomous driving, resilience of power grids, and also smart electrification. And on the global trade challenges, I mean, supporting, as mentioned as well, on the removal of unnecessary trade barriers, the US and EU can strengthen really the trade relationship. Also, we see opportunities here to speed up and also to accelerate the cooperation, the investment screening cooperation. Here we really call for closer transatlantic cooperation for investment screening that accelerate and facilitate investment arenas. But coming to your question on cybersecurity as well, ICT security and competitiveness coming here. I believe there are good examples of a transatlantic cooperation already. We would also recommend the initiative Charter of Trust, which is formed by leading global companies and organizations working together across the Atlantic to make digital world of tomorrow safer. The Charter of Trust really focus on protecting data of individuals and companies, prevent damage to people, companies, and infrastructures, and create a reliable foundation on which confidence in a network digital world can take root and grow. So we are initiators of this initiative as well. We're leveraged this opportunity with our partners and companies from several areas in several sectors. And I believe that plays a big role as well. Mentioning about the Privacy Shield, also very important as well to support the development and insecure and insecure flow of data, really strengthening this element. So I think there are many initiatives that can be leveraged. I think we're also engaging with other associations here on the other side of the Atlantic with the European Union as well in Germany, such as the TVI. And I think those are very important elements here that we can focus on in encompassing the several working groups, and then also that the industries and also associations can provide recommendations. So really welcome, and how can this turn into action, and how can we support on the TTC as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Greg, coming back to you, Christian referred to standards in the context of the TTC. You're an expert in standards. Intel is a company that's in a sector where standards play a huge role. How do you see the TTC playing a role in standards?
Thanks, John. Well, first of all, I agree generally with everything that Susan and Christian have said, and there are plenty of opportunities in the technology area for standard development initiated by the U.S. and the EU. Whether it's the responsible use of AI or in the privacy, security, cybersecurity space, there's plenty of opportunity. Past initiatives have failed because of a lack of motivation to seek common ground, and I think the chip shortage and the common elements for that shortage in the U.S. and EU is a great rallying cry, and we have a lot of common ground, as I've already stated, to develop standards that strengthen both of our supply chains, and because we have the same goals. And one case study that's interesting that we could learn from is in the responsible use of minerals, the conflict minerals issue, where Intel actually took a leading role here, and it started with a voluntary initiative. It led in the U.S. to the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act and the EU to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And those are both derivatives, if you will, of a common framework that OECD has published, and they're both implementing rules. And it would behoove us to make sure that the commission, or DG FISMA, works with the SEC to provide common regulatory frameworks. I would say a couple of things that we learned from that. One is it's important not to legislate everything, to let industry take the lead where they can. And in the conflict minerals area, there have been some partnerships that have been wildly successful in creating guidelines and other guidance that promotes the responsible use of conflict minerals in the supply chains. And so let those flourish, and then develop a common framework under an international guideline so that you reduce the amount of bureaucracy. You have common guidance, and that actually helps everybody align to the same set of objectives. And so, again, this is an area where there's been a lot of progress, a lot of public-private collaboration, and even transatlantic collaboration, and yet we can still do better. So it's an interesting case study going forward. And I think the TTC is a great forum to study these areas that have been successful, and then decide how can we apply them to new supply chains challenges, whether it's having a common set of standards to share information on security, supply chain vulnerabilities, or otherwise.
Thank you, Greg. I'd like to ask a question really for all three of you about infrastructure. The United States has just passed a major bipartisan infrastructure package. The EU is rolling out its Global Gateway project, which will move 300 billion euros in public and private infrastructure investments by 2027. How do you see transatlantic cooperation playing a role in infrastructure? And I welcome responses from any of you, but maybe Christian, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, well, we see positive perspectives related to the recovery programs in the United States and the European Union single market with the EU recovery plan and next generation EU, with great opportunities for future technologies as key pillars to COVID-19 recovery and resilience, but also look into the future. So digitalization, industry of the future, energy and decarbonization, smart infrastructure, energy efficient transportation, and resilient healthcare systems are covered, and I believe there are many elements in that regard. The recently passed infrastructure bill is a really historic investment, which Siemens is proud to have supported here, the current administration, with recommendations in Congress to pass. And we'll be partnered in the revitalization of U.S. infrastructure with investments here to help ease some supply chains issues by modernizing transit, electric and the logistics system. So I think the important elements here, also in the battery manufacturing, the country's important investments. So I believe those elements are very important on the cooperation. Siemens manufactures many products as well, so looking from a global supply chain as well. I mean, Siemens has U.S. markets and meets the Buy American and Buy American requirements. However, the reality of global supply chains, commercial products, and trade agreements must be considered in this cooperation. So I believe those are important elements. And when you mention about the global gateway, for example, initiatives really looking into other regions of the world, this is also an important element also that we see from the Build Back Better world discussed earlier this year. Is it important to strengthen domestic resilience on one side, but also to invest abroad, playing a role of for exporting companies, also expanding the global footprint and also generating jobs in the domestic market. But also working in the developing countries around the world, we see a strong need for cooperation technologies from the United States. And here to succeed in international markets, besides having the good quality, competitive price, technical and commercial compliance, companies may require also attractive financing solutions and conditions, also dealing in other countries. So the success here also of these programs lead also to consider also in many cases also training, education, jobs creation in the country of installation. So long-term commitments on investments in the country are also considered, and I think that they're important elements to leverage this on the transatlantic partnership. How can we best do on a bilateral basis, but also how can definitely invest abroad as well in other regions of the world.
Well, thank you. I'm reminded that we have just 3 or 4 minutes left here. And so I'd like to just sort of pose a last general question. And certainly if Susan or Greg want to add in on infrastructure as well. But I think just to frame this last thought, what are any other last thoughts you have on policies that the US and the EU can pursue that will favor the development of transatlantic supply chains over supply chains that involve countries that may not share our values or priorities? So basically, what are the public policies that really promote ally shoring? Susan, any thoughts?
Yes, maybe to give a few thoughts. Maybe I can make a few comments on what not to do as well, John. We've covered what to do, but I think it's important to remind everyone what not to do. One concern we have as US companies over here is the phrase strategic autonomy. We totally understand that Europe wants to create more strategic autonomy, but we're stressing the need for it to be open. So I think just let's bring in the word protectionism on either side of the Atlantic or anywhere in the world. It does not help anyone. So I think we have to be sure of avoiding that, and inadvertently as well. For example, I believe there's a regulation in the US which provides a tax break, but it excludes non-unionized companies. But that tends to cut out the European car manufacturers. It's probably inadvertent. And in the same way over in Europe, one concern is the imminent introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We're watching that carefully. We applaud the goals of that mechanism, but we've got to be sure that it doesn't inadvertently impact. It might be targeting China or other countries, but it might impact US companies. So we need to be careful with that. I think sort of one last comment to make here as well is about narrative, John. I think still, we're talking about supply chains. We understand the need, the complexity, the interdependence, why they're so important, but there's still a role here to create a narrative about trade and why this is important, whether it's trade in goods, whether it's trade in services. We still have a lot to do there to convince citizens and others about why the multilateral trading system and international trade is so important. And finally, it should be market. Yeah, you said public policies. Well, it should be market driven. Let's let companies take the lead here. And overall, my party word would be cooperation. Let's converse, collaborate, as an MEP said the other day to me, talk, but lots of C words, but mainly we need international cooperation and leadership from the EU and the US.
No, thank you, Susan. Well said. And whether it's under the headline of strategic autonomy in Europe or Buy American in the United States, these slogans can be indeed be very complicated when they impact real business realities. Greg, last thoughts from you.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. I mean, I like the word strategic autonomy, and it reminds me of what Commissioner Vestager said when she said self-sufficiency. I think she meant complete self-sufficiency is an illusion. And certainly that's true in our industry with a global supply chain. And so the question is, where can the US and the EU focus mostly, what are the critical supply chain gaps that they need to fill to have that strategic autonomy? Because they can't do everything. Nobody can do everything. And then where can they collaborate? We have relationships with multiple key R&D institutions in Europe, Fraunhofer, C, Leti, and others. And again, if you combine both onshoring, friendshoring with strategic, with collaboration, then you get everything that you can in an efficient and cost-effective way to build resilient supply chains.
Thank you, Greg. Christian, I'm afraid we're down to our last 30 seconds. Welcome a last thought.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So Siemens, as a wrap up, really supports the Transatlantic cooperation to focus on building strategic resilience to secure supply chains for critical materials, also semiconductors. I believe also we should be mindful in this cooperation the importance of also coordination and discussions, because also to avoid risk is also overcapacities in the long run. But my first thoughts, also linking to Susan, was about public policy that should aim to comply with fair competition, transparency, and integrity practices, which is our cornerstone also for our businesses. So some additional policies, I believe, the transatlantic investment strategy, also focusing on strategic resilience and avoid duplication in investments, as mentioned. Also the element of cooperation in areas in pilot projects, lighthouse projects in areas, semiconductors, Industry 5G, EV charging, smart cities also. And also, as mentioning about the component of professionals, the focus on the exchange of researchers. And finally, also the reform of WTO, I think, plays a big role. As a global operating company, we're interested in increased market access, reduction of trade barriers, and reduction of dependency of raw materials from economic areas. So really hope this plays a big role here in the cooperation and the many activities. Thank you.
Christian, that's a great note to end on. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists here today, Susan, Greg, Christian. And we will turn now to the next segment in the conference, which is an interview with European Union Executive Vice President Vestager. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to you, Susan, Christian, Greg, and John, for a very interesting panel on supply chain security. Yesterday, we heard from a thoughtful group of executives about the vital importance of keeping the transatlantic economy connected. We're returning to this theme with our next featured speaker. We also talked yesterday about the importance of transatlantic partnership and the imperative of transatlantic leadership. Nowhere is this more important than when it comes to digital policies. The world is moving fast, and the US and EU are best positioned to lead when we're pointed in the same direction. There are several issues on which we see eye to eye: ensuring the internet remains open, protecting freedom of expression, countering disinformation, and protecting our e-commerce markets from counterfeit goods. We can also use the US-EU Trade and Technology Council to develop common approaches to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing, work that should be done in close coordination with stakeholders. But as Secretary Raimondo said yesterday in her remarks, the Biden administration has serious concerns about some of Europe's direction of travel when it comes to digital policies, as reflected in particular in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. We share the administration's concerns, not simply because they have a disproportionate impact on American companies, but because these policies might also hinder companies in Europe who are seeking to innovate and grow, undermining the very competitiveness that Europe seeks to nurture. We share Europe's desire to foster a more vibrant and competitive digital economy, but we believe some aspects of these policies are misguided. These are complex topics and deserve careful consideration and thoughtful debate, and we look forward to continuing a constructive conversation with policymakers. We're very fortunate to be joined this morning by someone who is an expert on these issues. European Commission Executive Vice President for a Europe Fit for the Digital Age, Margrethe Vestager. EVP Vestier leads the Commission's work on digital issues, including the data strategy and also on artificial intelligence, which we talked about yesterday. She also serves as the Commissioner for Competition and, like Ambassador Tai, who was here this morning, serves as one of the co-chairs of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. Prior to joining the Commission, she also served as Minister for Economic Affairs in her native Denmark. I'm told as well that she's very fond of knitting. I've heard rumors that sometimes she knits small elephants when she's in meetings. Now, I'm not sure if that says more about her love of knitting or the kinds of meetings that she finds herself in, but that's certainly something I'd like to see. In fact, I understand there may be a tweet out there about it. There are tweets for everything, no doubt. We're also delighted that CNBC's senior White House correspondent, Kayla Tausche, will interview the Executive Vice President after her opening remarks. Kayla herself is no stranger to Brussels, having served there earlier in her career. Without further ado, Madam Vestier, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this introduction, but also thank you very much for putting me on after this wonderful panel, since I'm one of the promoters of the concept of open strategic autonomy, because actually I think that one can do both. It's an honor to be invited to speak here today. And I was reminded of words of Thomas Jefferson. He said, and of course ages ago, but he said, "Truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. She's the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict." That was 1799. And I cannot help to wonder what Jefferson would have said today. In a world where spreading disinformation seems to be a discipline, if not a science, in itself, where foreign governments launch sustained campaigns to undermine our democracy, where the public square is fragmented into increasingly polarized bubbles of sorts driven by profit-making algorithms. Digitization brings enormous benefits, and I think even greater promise for our economies and for our societies. But it's also true that we have not been always quick enough to see the downsides. That is changing. This week, President Biden hosts the Summit for Democracy. He has spoken of the need for democracies to deliver in the face of autocracies as the most defining challenge of our time. And how we will do that, of course, will have to take many different forms. For me, the most pressing is our approach to technology. To show that technology can lift people up rather than to pin them down. That is indeed one of the great challenges of our time. And it has two distinct sides. First, to make sure that democracy retains the technological edge. In order to do that, we need massive investment in innovation. The EU Recovery and Resilience Plan was conceived as a collective effort to sort of kickstart Europe's recovery and Europe's economy after the pandemic. And what it does is that it targets unprecedented levels of investment in innovation, covering everything from 5G to fiber rollout to advanced digital skills. And I know and I see that a similar drive is present here in the US. And second, in both the European Union and the United States, our duty to the truth is that we create a framework for technology that serves our people and our democracies, and not the other way around. Internationally, it's happening already. Countries around the world, they are moving swiftly to regulate the digital space. And some of this, of course, is welcome. but much of it is fragmented, and some of it is actually quite worrying. An autocratic model of digital governance is not only taking shape, but also spreading around the world. So it's crucial that the US and Europe lead the way for a democratic framework for technology. In Europe, we've been moving ahead for some time in setting up such a rulebook. And we see how things are also picking up here. Together to lead the ways of setting the rules of the road for the 21st century. Based on shared democratic values, I think we can show that democracies can get in control of technology and ensure that it works for people and not the other way around. And we can start by defining rights and principles that every citizen should have online. Empower people. Everyone should be in control of the personal data that they create online. Everyone should be able to determine how it's being used, how it's being shared, since it is their data. Everyone should be able to express themselves in an open online environment without fear of censorship or intimidation. Everyone should have a chance of obtaining the digital skills needed to fully participate in an increasingly digitalized world. Yesterday, I discussed our plans because we are setting up a set of digital rights. And I discussed with Dr. Landers and Nielsen how this initiative can fit with the considerations and the thoughts and the works here on a US AI Bill of Rights. And I see there's much room for convergence. Our discussions in the Trade and Technology Council, I think that shows that we share a fundamental goal of promoting trustworthy AI through a proportionate and risk-based approach. For AI to thrive, it needs enormous amounts of data. And for people to trust technology, they must be in control of their personal data. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation was groundbreaking as an initiative to protect digital privacy. And since it was passed by our legislature, we have seen privacy laws in jurisdictions all across the world, including in several US states. I would hope for the land of the free also to have a federal digital privacy law. But perhaps the most urgent parts of this democratic framework is content moderation. For sometimes, I think the dangers posed by algorithmic amplification, those dangers, they have been quite clear. If the storming of the Capitol Hill was a wake-up call, well, then the revelations of Francis Haugen, well, they are a call to action. The EU's new Digital Services Act is designed to keep online consumers safe from illegal, from dangerous products. But it is as much designed to protect rights and freedom, including, of course, the freedom of speech. We are not regulating content. This is not our mission. But what we want to regulate is the way in which digital companies deal with content. And what we want is greater transparency and redress for individual users whose content has been removed. And we want greater accountability for big platforms for the society at large, where their activity may have an impact on democratic debate or an impact on mental health, for instance, on young women. We know difficult debates, they are taking place here in Washington right in these times. And it's a tricky subject. And I think that even though our systems are different, well, we do share some of the fundamentals. And of course, I hope that our experience can serve as inspiration to the debates here in Washington. Then there are the digital markets in themselves. To state the obvious, open and fair markets, well, they are a shared objective across the Atlantic. And the reason why it's obvious is that it provides opportunity. It's one of the reasons why prosperity is created. And frankly, I think it's quite thought-provoking that exactly those opportunities, well, 20 years ago, that was what created what has made the tech giants of today, an open and contestable market that gave you a fair chance to succeed. That is the strength of open market economies. And it's the recipe also for success in competition with autocracies. Democracies will not outcompete China by protecting incumbents. But what we should do is to create competitive framework that ensures that new ideas can indeed flourish, find their way to the market, and grow. And this is what the new EU law, the Digital Markets Act, is about: open, contestable markets. It will recognize that there is a special role and responsibility of large gatekeeper platforms. It will impose upon them certain obligations to safeguard competition, to protect small digital players, and to ensure value and choice for consumers. And I'm pleased to say that we are making good progress in passing this law. And having visited Capitol Hill yesterday, I sense a strong convergence in the concerns that we share and a bipartisan will to address them. Of course, the European Union has no wish to act alone. We know what a world we live in. For decades, the world's open and free markets has been protected by a really strong consensus. I mean, the Bretton Woods system, the rule book that has guided international business and financial relations now for nearly 80 years. And Europe's call is to renew that commitment, to design a new system together, one that builds on the success of Bretton Woods, but fit for the digital age that we live in. Recent Transatlantic talks, they have been going just in this direction. And I'm pleased to say that the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council was a genuine success. We have also just this week launched the Joint Dialogue for Competition Policy to help us deal with common challenges in tech and digital markets. A lot of things have changed since Jefferson's time. Frankly, much to the better. Yet the fundamental principles and values that we share, they have not changed. These principles, they still define us. They define our democracy. They define our free and open markets. And as long as we remain guided by them, well, I am convinced that Jefferson will be proven right. Truth will prevail. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to the Chamber audience for having us, and to Marjorie for that kind introduction, and especially to the Executive Vice President of Vestiaire for allowing me to be here for this conversation. You laid out quite a few things for us to discuss, but I would like to start having you elaborate on your meetings here in Washington this week. You have met with officials from Commerce, Treasury, Trade, Antitrust, and then a bipartisan group on Capitol Hill. You talked about areas of convergence and areas of divergence. What are some of those areas, and how should we expect the transatlantic relationship to move forward from there?
One obvious area of convergence would be artificial intelligence. We have worked for a very long time to find an approach because we don't want to regulate technology. We want to deal with use cases. And many, many use cases, there is no need for any regulatory touch. Where we find that there is a need for regulatory touch is where fundamental values is at stake. If there is a risk of bias, if there is a risk that people cannot trust that they are seen as who they are, but seen with their color, their zip codes, their ethnic background, their religion, then you don't trust that it will work, and the market will close rather than open. And here we have an agreement in the Pittsburgh Statement of the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council that we share this approach. Then there will be European legislative work, US legislative work, but we also agreed to try to figure out how to measure whether or not data sets are good, that AI is not biased, so the companies on both sides of the Atlantic know that they are indeed in the safe zone, using tools in order to know that they're there. Where we still have work to do would be when it comes to data flows. I think everyone knows this. It's a colleague of mine who was responsible for that. And we have some more long-term work to do, for instance, when it comes to making sure that the semiconductor supply chains, that they keep delivering and that we can prevent future areas of shortage as the very damaging ones that we're experiencing right now.
But it would seem that regulation of technology companies is among the more near-term priorities, both in Europe and in the United States. The Digital Markets Act could potentially become law by the second half of next year. I'm interested in hearing how you think and what assurances you have that regulation like that would spur innovation and growth instead of the opposite.
Well, what we see is that if you depend on a gatekeeper to get to your potential customers, it can be difficult to attract investors for innovation because it's not your ideas, it's not your work ethic, it's not your business model that you invest in, it's basically access to market, whether you have that or not. And as we see it, if we can open those gates, making sure that the market is open and contestable, well, that is driving investment in innovation for many more businesses than what we see today.
So more small businesses could sell their products on Amazon or could access a social media platform to reach customers, you are saying?
Yeah, and I think in many more areas as well, because what we see right now is the digitization of everything. Digital agriculture, transport, energy, health, public services. And here, we expect, innovation really to take off. And then it's really important that you can find your customers, that you are not in a situation where you depend on others opening the gates to the market or not.
But largely the gatekeepers are United States technology giants. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies said this discriminatory targeting of US companies in disregard of Europe's WTO obligations raises questions about Europe's overall commitment to the rules of a multilateral trading system as they apply to tech platforms, digital services, and the digital economy. Do you believe that? How would you respond to a claim that this is discriminatory and also that it goes against Europe's WTO obligations?
Well, of course, when we design a legislative proposal, we make sure that we check our international obligation. So obviously not in conflict with WTO. Second, our fundamentals is equal treatment. You are more than welcome to do business in Europe, but there is one single rule book for everyone. And that is one of the reasons why numerous companies from all over the world, including the US, do very good business in Europe. I think actually some of the tech giants, they have a better business in Europe than they do have here. So what we have done is that we have translated our insights from the competition casework as to what defines market power, translated that into objective criteria to say, well, if you have that kind of market power, then you also have a responsibility that the little guy would not have. And this also means that you can sort of grow into being regulated in this way. And this is why it's important for us also to send this very strong signal to some of the Chinese players who have a small footprint in Europe right now. But if they grow to have a bigger footprint, of course, they would have exactly the same obligations.
The legislation would require that large companies cannot share data between different subsidiaries, that they cannot promote their own products on different parts of the platform. Would it be better, in your view, for all of these companies to simply break up? If you're trying to restructure the way that they do business internally, are you simply just trying to restructure the companies in the way that they look in the European marketplace?
No, that's not for us. And I don't think that the illegal behavior that we have seen in our competition cases is an expression of bigness or inherent in company culture. I think they are conscious decisions taken, and that sort of anti-competitive behavior can be changed. And this is why we think that you can have, in this situation, both your cake and eat it. You can be a large, successful company and showing sort of the necessary restraint in how you use your power so that the market stays open. And there are differences. You know, if you're a small business, you can do a lot of things, but your business partners, they can go to someone else if they don't care. It's like you have a small dog, it barks and jumps and it's a bit annoying. Eventually you will take it out. But if the big guy comes in and say, oh, well, then the entire situation in the room changes. Because if you have that kind of market power, you can ask of exclusivity, you can promote yourself ahead of others, you can take data instead of giving data to the ones who create them themselves. And I think that's a fundamental European approach, that with power comes responsibility, not to use that power to close the market.
And if a company feels or believes or has evidence that the European Union is wrong in an allegation that it is making against the company, what is their due process to raise those complaints? That's an issue that's been raised by the Commerce Secretary just on the stage today.
We have what we call sort of regulatory dialogue in order to make sure that the obligations are, of course, seen and understood. And we also have some flexibility as to what would be relevant, because obviously platforms are different, businesses are different. So we have that room for regulatory dialogue. And of course, also as in specific cases, the courts are open to make the final interpretation of what the legislature have decided.
Critics have also suggested that the Digital Markets Act would allow some of these large US giants to shrink, but it would come at the expense of Europe and the US, and that Chinese internet giants would instead be able to fill that vacuum. Do you believe that is one possible outcome of this?
No, I don't think so. First, we don't see a huge Chinese footprint in Europe. If there would be a bigger footprint, they would fall exactly into the categories of what would define a gatekeeper. So that would be a string on them. And I would actually have the opposite concern, that if we had no regulation, we would be left with very few opportunities actually to get in control of something that we dislike. One of the things, for instance, in the Digital Services Act, we ask platforms to know their customers, their business customers, so that you know that the people doing business on your platform are businesses that can live up to, importer responsibility, consumer rights, that people can return their goods if they are flawed, so that you don't have rogue traders coming up. And that, I think, is also bringing a bit of order in the international marketplace, because a lot of people, they suffer from rogue traders who come up and then bounce back, come up and then bounce back. So I think also in that respect, that creates transparency and trust in what platforms deliver.
Yesterday, you met with top lawmakers who are leading the charge on antitrust and writing some of these regulations for big tech. What elements of the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act do you get the sense could be implemented here? What are they taking from the European playbook? and trying to put into their own legislation?
Well, a number of different things. Of course, the approach is different, and our legislative processes are also different. But it's, for instance, a thing like exclusivity is being discussed. A thing like self-preferencing is being discussed. So it's they have made sort of they have different pieces of a puzzle, but I think basically the picture that you will have by the end of the processes could actually be quite similar.
And when do you see the end of that process here in the United States wrapping up? Obviously, it's a much different process than in Europe, but there was a global tax agreement that was reached earlier this year among the OECD countries that would implement a digital services tax on the profits of a lot of these companies. But the legislative bodies in all of these countries have to pass it, and it is expected to come in concert with digital regulation here in the US. I've heard some European officials say it might be 2024 at the earliest. What's your expectation?
Well, I have great expectations for the European legislator, for our Parliament and Council to reach agreement, because they have already established their separate positions. I kind of know how the European democracy works. I think I watch and learn about the US democracy.
I think many of us here in the US would also feign ignorance about some of the legislative sausage making and how long it can take. But realistically, these companies are trying to figure out how and in what environments they will be able to operate during timeframes and fiscal years. And to the extent that the OECD and transatlantic allies are having these discussions, do you have any expectation for when roughly there will be some transatlantic convergence on both the digital services tax and the type of regulation that we're talking about?
Well, we are quite advanced in our legislative procedure. You know, it's for the Commission that I represent to put forward proposals. Then the Parliament establishes their position, Council establishes their position, and then the three institutions have sort of the final negotiations about the final text. And that final negotiation is going to take place this spring, which means that the Digital Markets Act could come into effect 1st of January 23, which for our European democracy is really fast, which shows that it's a high priority both in Parliament and among member states. We are fully committed to the OECD processes, having worked for that for a very long time, very much appreciating the US involvement. I think that was critical to get an agreement. And I think it would be really, really good if we could have that agreement implemented, because it would give, I think, you know, calm and predictability when it comes to also digital taxation, instead of that sort of somewhat fragmented situation that we have before. So we are fully committed, and of course we will do our part to do as we promised and implement in Europe.
Congress here in the United States is also considering a bill that would provide $52 billion in incentives to companies to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. The previous panel talked about your comments recently, where you said that one should not expect manufacturing independence on semiconductors, and you advised against an incentives race that would leave everyone poorer. Could you explain those comments and why a country should not be offering incentives to bring jobs and production back to their country to serve their own customer base?
Well, from our point of view, the point would not be to bring back, because the European share of chips production globally is about 10%. 30 years ago, it was like 50%. So we have really seen that European businesses, they are big customers of chip production, but with very little production in Europe. And it's very important for us to increase production capacity in Europe. But it's also important that European businesses can be supplied all the different kinds of chips that they need. You can have also in an electrical car, you can have chips produced with legacy technology and cutting edge, leading edge technology. You can have chips that are very power resistant. You can have chips that would have other functionalities. So we would want to do our part when it comes to the production of equipment to produce chips, when it comes to research and innovation in both areas, Europe have leading capabilities, and establish production and more research in Europe. But we would want to do that with an understanding of an international market, that European businesses would be customers of US production and vice versa, that what happens in South Korea and Japan would be as relevant. So that we, from a democracies of the world perspective, also see how can we make semiconductor supply chains resilient, and how can we avoid single points of failure? Because when we experience that, we see how our economies are, put to a stop.
I know that that is something that our officials here and in the Europe are very focused on. And I have so many follow-up questions on that specific front. And I know that we are running out of time, but I don't want to end this conversation without asking about Ukraine. I know it is not part of your portfolio, but when the European Commission president was in Washington visiting with White House officials and the business community last month, it was, of course, the highest priority part of the discussion. And I'm wondering, from where you sit, given how high a priority that topic is for the Transatlantic Alliance right now, does it cloud your agenda? Does it cloud what the Commission is able to get done right now?
Well, I think it's really important for any administration to be able to do quite a number of things at the same time. And it was very important for us to have the conversations here in Washington on Ukraine. Following that, of course, really close. It's our neighbors, so it's of the essence. But here, the relationship with the US obviously is key to deal with both the situation as it is and different scenarios that may develop. But we cannot give up on what builds the future, because we have a very problematic concerning situation right now in a specific point. We deal with the pandemic, the Omicron getting the booster shots out to people. We've had the situation at the Polish and some of the Baltic borders created by Lukashenko, weaponizing people in a very difficult situation, while at the same time investing in research, in education, in digitization, in the recovery, not just to get back to where we were, but indeed to transition into being a continent that can answer our obligation when it comes to fighting climate change, and of course to make the best of digital. And we need to be able to embrace the world as it is and get all these different things done more or less at the same time.
And I know the work on all of those fronts will continue, and we will let you get back to it. And we appreciate your time today, Commissioner Vestager. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to our discussion on transatlantic trade issues. My name is Noah Barkin, and we have two excellent panelists with us today. Before I introduce them, I'd just like to let everyone know that this portion of the agenda is going to be held off the record. So from Brussels, I'd like to welcome Rupert Schlegelmilch, who is Acting Deputy Director General at DG Trade, the European Commission's Trade Directorate, with a focus on the Americas and agriculture. And in Washington, we have Dan Mullaney, who is Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East. Both Dan and Rupert are heavily involved in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, primarily Working Group 10 of the TTC, which focuses on global trade challenges. Now, we have seen substantial progress over the past half year in removing some of the trade irritants in the transatlantic relationship, Airbus, Boeing, steel and aluminum. But as we head into 2022, I think everyone would agree that the US and the EU need to build on this and show that they can create a positive trade agenda, which is not always easy given the politics around trade these days. Dan and Rupert, welcome. I'd like to start out with a question for both of you, and maybe Rupert can go first. My first question is about the TTC, which held its first meeting in Pittsburgh in late September, produced a long to-do list, and will reconvene in the second quarter of next year. And I realize that it's early days, but what would you say, Rupert, about what you would like to see coming out of the second meeting in a few months' time? In an ideal world, on the trade side of things, what would you like to see in the run-up to that meeting?
Thank you, Noah, and thank you for that question. I think it's important to first say that the TTC is indeed what you've mentioned. It's a positive platform for engagement after getting rid of many of the legacy issues that you mentioned, at least temporarily. What I would like to get out of the TTC in the next meeting is tangible issues which actually show that this cooperation that we have set up leads to value added, if you wish, outcomes in the transatlantic relationship and for the world, if you wish, for the global economic governance. What exactly that will be, we'll have to sort out. We have, I think, promising work ongoing on quite a number of issues. One is the work on turning the principles that we have on AI into something which can actually be implemented and make a difference on the ground beyond the strategic heights of principles. Another one is the cooperation on labor that we are dealing with in Working Group 10, which has been something which we picked up gladly from the queue of the worker-centered trade policy, that is USTR's. One of the paradigms for USTR's work, which is also resonates well in Europe. And other issues which could come out of the next TTC will have to be defined, but they should really, for example, on supply chains, really make a difference in mapping also, and then in the policy response approaches, coordinated or aligned approaches in the policy response on the many issues we're dealing with.
Thanks, Rupert. And what about you, Dan? What would you like to see? As I said, it is early days. The Pittsburgh meeting only occurred about, 2 months ago. But I imagine you're already working on what's next. So maybe you can give us a sense of what you would like to see.
Yeah, thanks, Noah, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I totally agree with Rupert that the key to the follow-up from the ministerial that we had on September 29th are tangible outcomes, concrete outcomes in all the areas that we're looking at. And in particular, in the Global Trade Challenges Working Group, this involves coordination with respect to non-market economy policies and practices in the international environment that really create strong threats to the transatlantic relationship and threats, frankly, to a lot of the values and objectives that we share in trade, including transparency, rule of law, the protection of worker rights. We also, I think, would be looking very much to horizon scan and see if we can avoid in advance unnecessary barriers to trade in goods and services before they arise. We all know that once unnecessary barriers get entrenched, it's hard to uproot them. But if we can anticipate where there are initiatives on either side that could create barriers, especially with respect to new and emerging technologies, we want to take action to try to avoid those barriers arising, consistent with, of course, achieving the regulatory objective. And then finally, as Rupert said, I think it's going to be very important that we can and we should really be able to come to some agreement on things that we can do to promote worker rights globally, particularly when it comes to forced labor and child labor. We both have provisions in our FTAs. We both have a lot of work going in our own domestic measures that try to push this outcome. And I think this is something on which we very much agree. And I think we ought to be able to achieve some concrete outcomes. And of course, we are engaging in a very robust process of stakeholder engagement and taking on board ideas that come from stakeholders. And so that's not a closed list of things that I mentioned. We'll be looking for other things that we can do, but I completely agree with Rupert that what's going to be very important is for us to have concrete and tangible outcomes coming out of Pittsburgh.
Well, thanks, Dan. I want to pivot off of something that you just mentioned, which is forced labor, and come back to Rupert. Obviously, this is an issue that is on the minds of businesses in the U.S. And in Europe, where there is a lot of legislation that is sort of in the pipeline, supply chain due diligence, etc. Rupert, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced in her State of the Union in September that the EU was going to introduce a ban on products made with forced labor. There's no legal basis for this at the moment. Can you give us any clarity on what the EU is planning to do here, and talk a little bit about how the US and the EU can cooperate on the issue of forced labor to sort of align their policies? Because I expect that's, for businesses, that's quite important that they have a bit of transatlantic alignment on this.
Yeah. Thanks, Noah, and thanks for mentioning this strong statement from the president, from our president, who actually made very clear that we will address the issue. The discussions on how exactly to do it, I mean, she talked about a ban for putting products on the market in the EU. How exactly to do it is still ongoing. You mentioned yourself the due diligence legislation, which we have promised some time ago, and we still haven't delivered. That's one of the options, and we're looking at the pros and cons of how exactly to do it. Because, as you know, it is complicated to have such a ban implemented. And you need evidence, you need to make sure who is actually responsible for proving what. But we will work on it, it will come out with a proposal. I can't really say much more which legal form it will take. But of course, it will be a legislative proposal, which will then give us the necessary legal basis.
And Dan, how can the U.S. and the EU cooperate here? I mean, as I said, this must be something that is important for businesses. You don't want a situation where American businesses are disadvantaged vis-a-vis European businesses because of rules around forced labor. So I imagine transatlantic alignment on this is a top priority.
Yeah, and I think the key is, as you mentioned, is for us to have the communication, to share the information, to share. We each have different experiences, different measures in place. We pursue the same goals, the same objectives, but we do it often in a slightly different way. And the TTC is an opportunity for us to share information on what each of us are doing, what works, what doesn't work. Ideally, that becomes turns into a more effective implementation, and one that provides some consistency and transparency for business. So I think the dialogue, the shared experiences, learning what we can learn from each other, I think is going to be incredibly valuable, both to make the individual measures that we each take to ensure labor rights abroad, but to make sure that the approaches are as effective as they can be.
Dan, I wanted to follow up with a question on a separate issue, which is the resumption of the trilateral discussions between the U.S., the EU, and Japan, which of course are very focused on addressing China's distortive trade policies. This grouping, I think it's fair to say, struggled to make headway in past years because of trade tensions with between the EU and the previous administration, and also the previous U.S. administration's approach to the WTO. What are you expecting out of this now? Do you think things will move fast? Is there any sort of timeline? I know this is just in the process of relaunching, but maybe you can give us some sense around that.
Yeah, sure. I think we're very optimistic. I mean, we're in a very different place today than we were even a short time ago. I think you yourself mentioned the elimination of many trade irritants, including with respect to aircraft. You also mentioned steel and aluminum. There's also the issues around the digital services tax, and we have this launch of a very robust and positive agenda, the Trade and Technology Council. So I think both the United States and the EU individually, and also in terms of the relationship, are in a much different place, and we're very much focused on eliminating some of the challenges between us that can be, and then moving forward with a positive agenda. The real benefit of having, of course, the trilateral discussion in this context is that these are objectives that all three parties very much share. The objective of pursuing a market-oriented conditions and ensuring that there is a market-based level playing field in the international trade environment. And since we are three large economies that are like-minded on these issues, it really presents a very strong opportunity for us to make progress, and in two areas in general. One, to look very carefully at whether all the tools, the implements that we have in place for addressing some of these non-market issues, whether they are really up to the task at this point, and whether we should be looking at other ways of addressing some of the challenges that are presented by non-market economy policies and practices. And then secondly, considering whether or the extent to which the current international rules that are in place, that are written down, are also fit for purpose in a very different environment than existed when they were first negotiated. So these are, I think, two important aspects that we're going to be looking at trilaterally, and frankly, the huge value add of having three big economies, three partners who are like-minded on this and who are in a position to talk about the new measures, the new tools that we can employ, as well as the new rules. I think will give us a really, I think, a good prospect for moving forward in a positive way.
Rupert, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about WTO reform and perhaps how this trilateral process fits in there. Unfortunately, the WTO ministerial had to be canceled in recent days, but I know that the EU has an idea to establish a working group to reform the WTO over a period of 2 years, come back with recommendations at the next ministerial. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how much support for that do you think there is?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the intention of the trilateral work is to feed into a process which is then, if you will, socialized to a larger group of countries. And ultimately, not everything that the trilateral work should achieve, because as Dan has said, we also look at our bilateral tools. but we will certainly want to bring these issues into the WTO. In the end, I mean, we have been very clear that industrial subsidies, rules on state-owned enterprises, tech transfer, or generally pro-competitive regulation, if you want to call it that, needs to find a place in the multilateral rulebook. We're not blue-eyed about this. It will not be easy, and you have to start with a coalition of the willing or a plurilateral agreement. But you have to widen, I think, the scope of this. But the trilateral is really the nucleus. Actually, there's even in the bilateral, in the working group 10, we also work on non-market economy. So that we have bilateral work, we have the trilateral, and we are certainly of the view that over time we will have to bring this into the WTO, into the whole discussion about WTO reform, because it's exactly the absence of these rules, the gaps in the rule book multilaterally, which makes the WTO lose credibility. It's a global governance instrument supposed to create a level playing field in the world. And we now see that many of the practices which are followed by some major WTO members cannot be addressed with what we have on the rule book. So the best way to deal with that, if you want to have a really global level playing field, is to use and reform the WTO so that these practices will be captured in the future.
And Dan, what is the feeling in Washington? Do U.S. officials have the patience to spend 2 years working on this, then come with recommendations? That certainly wasn't the position of the previous administration, but I think Catherine Tai has sent signals that the U.S. is committed to WTO reform. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. No, we are certainly committed to WTO reform. We're committed to the WTO. I think it's clear that not all the rules that were originally negotiated are 100% up to the task of dealing with the challenges of today. So the WTO is definitely a necessary, but perhaps not sufficient for addressing some of these issues. The good news is that it does appear that many like-minded partners in the WTO are in agreement that the WTO is in need of reform, and I think that provides a good basis for moving forward. But it's also the fact that we work very hard towards a reform of the WTO doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to have other discussions, bilateral discussions, and also use other instruments at our disposal to pursue those interests.
Rupert, I want to talk about some of the regulatory measures that are in the pipeline in Brussels, and there are quite a few. I've been watching this closely, and the foreign subsidies instrument that's been in the works for a while. Margareta Vestager leading the charge there. The international procurement instrument. I think there is some concern in the U.S. That American companies could be adversely affected by some of these measures, even if I think they're primarily aimed at China. Is there reason to be concerned? Can you say anything about this?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, first of all, it's true that we work on both sides. We work on the international rule book, but we're also trying to use our tools in a haste to say that in a WTO compatible way in order to address some of the issues. And you mentioned the foreign subsidies instrument. Until now, we have not been able to really use our competition rules, if you wish, to address distortions in the single market, which are caused by subsidies happening elsewhere outside the source country. This has been an important point to be addressed, and we can do that with our internal market instruments. The procurement instrument is something which is actually something where we have had a long frustration with the lack of openness elsewhere, while we thought our internal procurement market was pretty wide open, accessible worldwide. And we're trying to have a little bit of reciprocity, which used to be or is no longer a dirty word in Europe, to leverage a little bit the openness. We don't want to close our market, we want to open our market further. These instruments are not aimed at the US or anyone else. Well, to some extent, I think we know who they are mainly aimed at. And we would hope that in any case, we would not give the impression that this is something which is aimed at the United States.
And what about the Biden administration's Buy American policies? I saw that Trade Commissioner Dombrovskis recently said that the EU is taking a very close look at these. Obviously, these have the potential to be irritants in the relationship, and could be could come under scrutiny under the international procurement instrument. Of course, that's not in place yet, and it may not be for a while. But that's obviously that seems to be a concern in Brussels at the moment.
No, I can confirm that. Of course, we are not. We are concerned, and we are not happy with this push. We know why it is there, but we do not share the analysis that this would do necessarily a lot of good. The Buy America legislation, in particular, when it excludes, if it should exclude European bidders from the market, would be seen as an unwelcome act. Of course, we have to look at the legal situation. Not everything is bound under international agreement. Until now, we've always had also, I think, assurances that the obligations of the United States under the government procurement agreement, the WTO, would be honored. But it's still, I think, the political message which is passed here is of concern for us, because we, of course, also aware that many countries in the world might copy that and close their markets, while we certainly believe that competition should also play, fair competition should also play in procurement markets.
And Dan, I want to ask you about the EU's digital agenda, which obviously has been is being followed very closely in Washington and also in Silicon Valley. I mean, I think some people in Washington might say that this is targeting a small number of successful American companies. Is this? Do you see this having an impact on transatlantic cooperation within the TTC? The digital regulations that Brussels has been working on for some time.
Well, thanks. I don't see it as necessarily having an impact on the relationship, other than that agenda and the many other initiatives that are out there in Europe. You mentioned some, and in the United States. I mean, that really is the reason to have the kind of dialogue, positive dialogue, that we envision under the TTC. One of the objectives of the Global Trade Working Group is to, as I mentioned earlier, is to look at the various initiatives on both sides of the Atlantic, and to make sure that they, of course, they need to serve their legitimate regulatory purpose, but to make sure that there's no collateral damage, that we don't end up with barriers to trade that don't need to be there and are not related to or necessary to a legitimate regulatory objective. So we certainly approach any discussion with a view towards with a view on our stakeholders and protecting the interests of our stakeholders, and also looking at to make sure that the U.S. EU trade and investment and goods and services doesn't end up as collateral damage. Picking up on your earlier point, I think this is equally true of the domestic measures, and you spoke of a number of them in the EU that are potentially aimed at some of the non-market economy practices and policies. And I think there too, and very explicitly in the TTC, we've said we're going to look at those measures on both sides, US and the EU, both with the view towards increasing and improving their effectiveness, but also with a view to making sure that they don't create collateral damage on bilateral relations.
Rupert, perhaps a final question to you. We live in a world of new world of industrial policy and subsidies. Both the U.S. and the EU seem intent on pouring tens of billions of dollars and euros into to build up local semiconductor manufacturing capacity. This is still in the early stages, but moving along. This is an issue in the TTC, of course, and I think in an ideal world we would have a sort of a world of like-minded countries that are each providing part of the semiconductor supply chain, that aren't pouring lots of subsidies, that are, we don't have a sort of downward spiral race to the bottom on subsidies, that there's cooperation in the semiconductor supply chain. What do you think the prospects are there for cooperation, and do you see any scope for this to sort of damage transatlantic relations?
Yeah, thank you, Noah. And I agree with you that industrial policy no longer is a dirty word on both sides of the Atlantic, and this is something which we certainly have to factor in. I think we also clearly see the possibility that we create tensions here by doing exactly what you said, by pouring money into the system, which might distort the markets in the future. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we also see the possible tension, and this is why we have a dedicated work stream on semiconductors in the TTC. Now, that is in group 3 and not my group, or at least that part of that group is not for me. But it's clear that, of course, while both sides are very busy discussing either in Congress or within the Commission, we haven't come up with our CHIPS Act. That we are also very much focused on trying to see what is possible within our systems, but it's exactly what the TTC should do, is to make sure we don't lose sight of the bigger picture, the effects on third countries, in particular the effects on the transatlantic market. And I'm pretty confident that we can actually manage that in order to avoid that we will try to outcompete each other in this field. It's challenging, but I think we have started some good work also on identifying where the gaps are. But it's clear that for production capacity as such, a lot of money will be needed.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time already. I want to thank Dan Mullaney of USTR and Rupert Schlegelmilch at DG Trade for joining us today for this excellent discussion. I think we'd all agree that 2021 was a bounce back year for US-EU trade relations. Let's hope that Washington and Brussels can keep up that momentum in 2022. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Rupert and Dan.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.
And thanks to the Chamber.
Yes, thanks for hosting us. Bye-bye.
Well, we just got the policymaker perspective on the challenges presented by non-market economies like China, and now we are going to get the view from the business community on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm very pleased to welcome Luisa Santos, who is Deputy Director General of Business Europe, based in Brussels. And in Washington, we have Jeremy Waterman, who is President of the China Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We only have about 20 minutes, so I want to delve right into the conversation. And I'd like to start with a question to both of you about how you think your governments are doing in responding to China. Luisa, let's start with you. We've been through a pretty turbulent year in EU-China relations with the exchange of sanctions, the collapse of the EU-China investment agreement, rising tensions over Taiwan and human rights. The EU is now rolling out a raft of new regulations. We got the anti-coercion instrument. Proposal for that came out just yesterday. And we also have a new German government, which could also change things. So a lot going on. From the perspective of European business, what is the EU doing right, and what concerns you? What do you think they need to do better?
Well, good morning, everyone in Washington and in the US, and good afternoon to those in Europe that are following. I think that as a basis, I will mention our strategic paper, Business Europe's strategic paper on China, on EU-China relations, where we actually said very clearly that we would need a multidisciplinary approach when it comes to China. So we cannot use only one way. And in this perspective, I think that, as you mentioned, Noah, we are doing pretty well on the unilateral front. So we see definitely an increase in the instruments to address the disruptions caused by non-market economies and some of the practices, the market distorted practices that are coming from these economies, including China. You mentioned there is the instrument on foreign subsidies. We are expecting that finally next year, possibly during the French presidency, we'll finally have the instrument on international procurement. We have the anti-coercion. So we are doing very well on the unilateral front. Where we are not doing so well lately is on the bilateral front and the plurilateral, multilateral. I mean, we are very happy to see that the trilateral discussions between Europe, the US, and Japan are resuming, because we definitely need rules in the area of subsidies, in the area of state-owned enterprises, of forced technology transfers. And on this, we have to do, we cannot do alone as Europe. We need to work with other partners, including the US. So we're very happy in Japan. We're very happy to see that this is resuming. I think one of the most important things is we need also as Europe and US to agree on what we think it's a distorted subsidy, and then the best way to address it. And this will also enable us to make proposals also to other partners. And then bilaterally, EU and China, as you mentioned, the relationship has gone under a very difficult period lately after the sanctions and counter-sanctions. We used to have the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment as the main framework for our bilateral relations. We know that the ratification of the CAI is now on freeze. We understand, but of course for us as business, we still think that the merits are there to have a comprehensive agreement on investment with China. It's not going to solve all the bilateral problems, but it would address some of the distortions that exist in terms of rules, but also the market unbalance that exists currently, where Chinese companies have access to the European market and European companies do not have that access. So here we have to find new ways of engaging with China. And this is what we are looking very much for at the moment as European business. how can we engage with China on issues that are of common interest? Climate change, standardization, also WTO reform, and trade in general. So we need definitely to keep the dialogue with China. We just need to find ways as well of maintaining this engagement, while at the same time cooperating with other partners and being assertive as well and taking unilateral measures forward.
Well, Jeremy, you heard Louisa. I have a similar question for you. We're now nearly a year into the Biden administration. We've seen certainly a change in rhetoric compared to the Trump administration in terms of how the administration talks to and about China. We've seen an aggressive push to bolster alliances, including with Europe. But many Trump-era policies, tariffs, for example, remain in place. What is your assessment of how the administration has done on China so far?
Thanks, Noah, and it's great to be here with you and Louisa this morning and certainly this afternoon in Europe. So to delve right in, I think we know the broad policy objectives of the Biden administration's what I would call still nascent China policy. There is certainly the bilateral component with China, characterized characterized by the so-called triple C: the compete, the confront where necessary, the cooperate where we can. I think, obviously, we've seen some dialogue. Obviously, the two presidents had a conversation last month, and the business community would like to see, to Louisa's point, I think the U.S. business community is in the same place as the European business community in terms of the need to continue to have dialogue, to continue to find those areas of shared interest and cooperation, and to advance those areas. Ambassador Tai delivered a speech in early November that amounted, I would say, to some small steps forward. The announcement of a narrow tariff exclusion process, an effort to try to secure full implementation of phase one. In the business community, we'd certainly like to see that tariff exclusion process advanced expeditiously, and we'd like to also see it broaden considerably. And while I would say on phase one, the deal is not necessarily the agreement the business community wanted, we nonetheless think it's important that it be fully implemented to show all sides that agreements between governments are adhered to fully. And to the point of your question and comments, we've also seen some fine-tuning of regulatory actions of the Trump administration to eliminate aspects of what I would characterize as self-harm. I think it's also no secret that the second pillar of this administration's, or perhaps it's really the first pillar of this administration's, China policy is domestic investment and revitalization. Those things remain the top priority. Obviously, the infrastructure package for this administration, reconciliation, of course, the pending China competition package on Capitol Hill, which contains funding for, among other things, the CHIPS Act. And the third pillar, which I think we're really here to talk about today, is to enhance work with allies and partners. I'll return to that piece in a moment. I think, as I noted, there are a range of areas where there isn't clarity around the China strategy or policy. And now, more than 11 months into the administration, there is perhaps a degree of treading in Trump's water, you might say. And I think Bob Zoellick, former USTR, former World Bank president, articulated some of that in his op-ed yesterday in the Financial Times. I think, to be fair, any administration would struggle with how to approach China because of the complex nature of the challenge. China has been on a path that forecloses opportunities for engagement with foreign business, including U.S. business, notwithstanding the very robust commercial relationship that exists. And that path long predates the Trump administration. And some of the features of that path I would put forward would be the zero COVID strategy that is taking a toll on of course, business travel, on people-to-people engagement. the conception of comprehensive or absolute security as espoused in the national security law, the national intelligence law, the cybersecurity law, and so forth. Indigenous innovation and all of its progeny and permutations, whether we're talking about strategic emerging industries, made in China 2025, dual circulation, secure and controllable, and other aspects of what seems to be an emerging data and digital fortress in China, and also extraterritorial application of law and coercive diplomacy. So in sum, it's very challenging. It's a very challenging, in fairness to the Biden administration, very challenging endeavor to address the legitimate national security concerns associated with China's growing military capabilities, to recalibrate some of the uncomfortable dependencies that have developed with China, to insulate the U.S. economy and those of our allies and partners from some of the externalities of the China model, and uphold our U.S. Values and principles while preserving what is a very large and important commercial relationship with continuing areas of mutual benefit and interest, and maintain stability of the global economy that remains beset by a pandemic, rising inflation, and fragile supply chains. That's a challenge that certainly will make anyone's head hurt, I think. I think the Biden administration has done a very good job thus far of working to reset with allies and partners in Europe in particular. Both parties had to come to the table to resolve some of the challenges that had built up. And I think the Biden administration, as well as those in Europe, deserve immense credit for going the extra mile to resolve the aircraft subsidy, aluminum and steel, and digital tax disputes, and in really resetting the relationship to where it was in many respects prior to President Trump's term. And so as we return to that kind of a relationship, I think there are questions. The big questions are how we can work together, how the two governments can work together in an impactful manner that reinforces those shared interests, that promotes market-based competition, preserves, of course, as much of our commercial engagements with China as possible, and upholds our values and principles. I think, Luisa may disagree with me on this front, but I think there are more questions at this point in Europe about how far Europe is willing to go with the United States to address what is now largely, I think, a shared diagnosis of the challenge, but of course is a very complex challenge. So I'll leave it there and look forward to next question.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. Louise, I want to come back to you. Jeremy touched on this. We are seeing China taking extensive steps to become more self-reliant, localizing supply chains, dual circulation, and also limiting the role of foreign investors in certain sectors of the Chinese economy. How would you say European companies are coping with these pressures? Are they reassessing their commitment to the Chinese market in any way?
Well, I think I totally agree with diagnosis that was made by Jeremy. I mean, we have a number of initiatives also in China that, together with initiatives in Europe and US, are favoring de facto decoupling. This means when we have increasing number of conflicting legislation, and we have now the anti-foreign sanctions law in China that will very likely create problems for European companies when it comes, for instance, the mandatory due diligence initiative that is coming up in Europe, where companies need to decide which rule they will apply, and the likelihood of having being impacted negatively by sanctions on either side is extremely high. So this is, of course, playing a role in companies' decisions how to invest and how to remain and operate in China. I think the latest data we have from the European Chamber of Commerce in China actually says that there is only 9% of the companies responding to their inquiries that are thinking about leaving China. This is the lowest percentage so far. So it is showing as well that even if companies are aware that staying the same way in China, in Europe, in the US might be at risk, they still want to remain in China. And they also want to increase their presence in China, expand operations in China, about 60% say so. And they want even to have more onshore and more production in China. So what is happening is actually that companies are trying to maintain a presence in China, sometimes becoming more and more Chinese. And I think the fact that we have these travel restrictions that are also not facilitating the exchange of people and the exchange, for instance, of management. We are seeing more and more Chinese management and less European, as we are with the Americans, I'm sure. This is also leading to a de facto decoupling, because you're going to have more and more two divergent business models. And the question at one point we can ask is how much the operations in China are mirroring, in terms of policies and practices, the operations of companies in Europe and the US. I think this is something that is very much at the forefront of our concerns. And what we need to ensure at least is that companies can continue at least to take advantage whenever possible of the business operations in the two markets. I don't think it is in people's interest in China, in Europe, or the US to have a decoupling. We need to continue to exchange. We need to continue to exchange people. We need to continue to exchange innovation. We need to continue to exchange technology standards. I think it's the way to evolve, and possibly at one point even try to convince China that there is an interest in some areas of becoming more open to what Europe and the US are doing. So I think we need, as business, to counter a bit this tendency of decoupling.
Jeremy, you heard what Louisa said about European companies and how they're viewing China. We have seen some prominent US companies recently leaving China, LinkedIn, Yahoo. Are there any concerns in the US business community about European companies perhaps trying to fill the gaps if American firms pull out of China?
It's a great question, Noah. And I guess before I answer it, I would just second what Louisa said about pushing back on decoupling. I think the U.S. business community is in a very similar situation in terms of continuing to need access to that China market as an export market, but also as a market for sales. Those exports support U.S. jobs at home. They support scale and competitiveness to allow our companies to compete in a highly competitive world. So very much agree with her assessment there. I think as to your question, and I think to be fair, I think there are concerns on both sides. But yes, certainly on the U.S. side, where the U.S. government has been, I would venture to say, more assertive and more forthright in the narrative and also in taking actions. And where U.S. companies have paid a price, I think there's real concern that as the U.S. government continues to ramp up, American business will be left on an island to face retaliation if the governments of the EU, the member states, Japan, and others don't adopt a like-minded approach. And it's really up to the governments, I think, to set the rules of the road here. And that's why the TTC, the EU-US dialogue on China, which just met here in Washington, EAS Secretary General Sonino and Deputy Secretary Sherman, and other fora are so critical to efforts to develop not only common understandings, but also common approaches. And I would add that for American business, I think some of our concerns right now about how this may play out are magnified at present, given the trajectory of the policy making that we're seeing in the EU and within some of the member states. And what do I mean by that? I think some of these policies have been alluded to in this program, but first, the DMA appears to be singularly focused on US technology platforms in the name of digital sovereignty. In France, we now see a new French cloud certification scheme that contains draconian ownership restrictions for non-EU companies, seemingly in violation of the GPA, that kind of rather resembles the kind of regime we have long seen in China that blocks market access and compels technology transfer through forced licensing arrangements. And third, it's been alluded to, the EU's draft foreign subsidies regulation sweeps in a number of incentives in our analysis that goes far beyond the WTO SCM agreement and distortive subsidies, and would essentially treat any type of U.S. government incentive like a Chinese government equity infusion. And so I think those kinds of approaches do raise questions about the degree to which not only we can develop a common diagnosis, but also a common approach to strengthen, to have strong bilateral relations, but also to have forge a common approach vis-a-vis China on the critical issues. And I would say the two that are, I don't know if they're the most important, but certainly two of the most important are subsidies and digital and data governance. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. Just maybe we don't have much time left, but I want to just perhaps a very quick question to both of you to wrap this up. We talked about this in the previous panel with Rupert Schlegelmilch and Dan Mullaney. This past year has been about removing irritants in the transatlantic relationship, establishing new structures like the Trade and Technology Council. My sense, and I'm sure you would agree, is that we now have a window to deliver real results, but not a big window. What is your wish list for 2022 when you look at transatlantic relations in the context of China? Jeremy, perhaps to you first.
Sure, thank you. And I agree with the limited window. I think look, Privacy Shield is I think the immediate task. It's certainly it's critical that we have that for bilateral relations, but I would say it's not enough. We hope the two governments will aim higher. We had a system that was working reasonably well in the eyes of many before it was not in terms of the views of the EU court. So getting back there is critical, but would not be a major step forward, I think, in addressing the data governance issues with other countries of concern. And we know that there's work going on export controls. I think that's an area where we hope there can be some targeted cooperation going forward, and want to find ways that I think our communities do talk about shared concerns and principles when it comes to those issues. I think better coordination around investment screening, that's something we've seen already, and I think there have been some cases already where we've seen some evidence of perhaps closer cooperation behind the scenes there. But I want to conclude by just returning to those two issues that I highlighted previously. Subsidies and data governance are really two areas where the two sides are going to have to come into better alignment so that we don't, and the business communities don't get sucked into a race to the bottom. And I think there's when we look at policymaking on both sides, but from our perspective, particularly on the European side, there's some real challenges there right now. So, and hopefully the trilateral, which had its first meeting very recently, can be a part of the solution there.
Louisa, very quickly, what about your wish list for 2022?
Well, I think the first point is that we need to improve our bilateral relation. I mean, it has changed. The setting has changed. The narrative has changed. We are cooperating again. That's very good. But we still have a lot to do together. And I think it is in the benefit of both to get, if we get a stronger relationship, it's also good in the way we approach third countries. I mean, Jeremy mentioned data flows, definitely an area that is very important. Also, all the other areas that are part of the TTC, including supply chains. And I think the policymakers, Rupert and Dan, mentioned semiconductors. Definitely, I think we need to cooperate also in supply chain resilience and diversification. But what we do not want is self-sufficiency and subsidization that leads to overcapacity. So I think here, also in this area of supply chains, apart from the area of subsidies, where we need to arrive to a joint effort and together with Japan come up with a concrete proposal on rules that we want in this area to be put forward to other partners in the WTO. We need to manage this bilaterally first, but then plurilaterally and hopefully multilaterally at one point.
Well, I want to thank you both for a really interesting conversation. I think we agree 2022 will be absolutely crucial, a crucial year for the U.S. and Europe to sort of build on the momentum that we've seen this past year. 2022 is really the year where we're going to have to see results from this closer engagement in the TTC and other forums. Jeremy and Louisa, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks for the great conversation.
Thanks
Great
a lot.
to see you both. Thanks, Noah. Thanks, Louisa.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, welcome to our panel on leveraging lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and maintaining our competitive edge. I'm Donna Leinwan-Leger, president of DC Media Strategies and former managing editor of USA Today. I'm delighted that you can join us for what I know will be a robust discussion about the economics and innovation in healthcare. I'll start by briefly introducing our panelists. First, we have Michaela Chen. She is the Vice President for International Government Affairs at Boston Scientific. She leads Boston Scientific's international government affairs efforts, and prior to her position at BSC, she worked as the Senior Trade Advisor for the European Union in Washington, D.C. Next, we have David Earnshaw, the Associate Vice President, Public Policy Europe for the global pharmaceutical company, MSD. In the US and Canada, that is known as Merck. David has worked on European and national policy, legislative, and political communications issues for more than 30 years, including in the European Parliament. And next, we have Terry Stewart. She is the Vice President and Head of Global Innovative Medicines Franchise Policy at EMD Serrano. She has extensive experience in domestic and international healthcare policy and regulatory affairs, particularly pertaining to pharmaceutical firms' operations. And she holds a law degree from Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to start us off with a really broad question here. We've now spent 2 years on pandemic footing that put healthcare top of mind for everyone. What lessons have we learned? Let me start with you, Michaela.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me today. It's lovely to be here. I'd like to start with a simple premise, right? We often say, I'm from Slovakia, where I was born, and we often say that health is the most important thing in life, but we hardly ever mean it unless something bad happens to us or our family members. And I think to that extent, the COVID has been this collective eye-opener about the importance of health in our own lives, but also for the policymakers to see how resilient healthcare systems are important. And on a global scale, how the global ecosystem needs to have open trade, resilient supply chains, stable regulatory environment, and provide the right incentives for medtech and pharma companies. So I'd like to start maybe with the first two and just drill a little bit deeper on the open trade and how that's so important. We've seen during the pandemic that there have been some countries, actually a number of countries, trying to impose export restrictions, or some countries, like in the US, we have seen the previous administration trying to limit the WTO government procurement coverage for medical devices in order to incentivize companies to come in. And we've been able to engage and explain that restrictions don't work, and instead the incentives do. And what I mean by that, not being able to sell from European countries to the US and vice versa wouldn't really help in any way American companies or European companies. And thankfully, the administration, the Biden administration, has taken the right approach, pragmatic approach, and withdrew that notification, realizing how damaging it would be. So to that extent, can we look at Health and Trade Initiative or expanding the GPA to really help the industry be more innovative, put some of the tariffs and other resources into R&D. Our company spends $1 billion in R&D every year. We have 119 clinical trials happening right now. So that's kind of one message on trade. The second one would be on supply chain resilience. Many industries, maybe all industries now face challenges on semiconductors. We are one of them, but I would like to say that it's not maybe all the same for all industries, right? If you look at the difference between having a gaming console or having a pacemaker, I think that the choice should be clear. And that's why we have asked and continue to ask governments to give priority to the healthcare sector as we face these shortages. Our industry currently only takes about 1% of the semiconductors. We use second or third generation of chips, but we've seen tremendous challenges, whether it's price gouging, whether it's hoarding, inability to get them on time. So this is something that we would like to see as the EU and US governments talk under the TTC or in different capacities about the supply chain resilience. So those are the two messages I'd like to point out, but I can discuss some of the regulatory issues later on.
Okay, great. Well, we will have 45 minutes to talk through all of these things. David, can you weigh in here?
Yeah, I think that was really interesting from Michaela, and I certainly agree with everything that she said. A couple of other points that I would add, however, I think certainly looking at it from a European perspective, one of the things that we saw in Europe at the beginning of the pandemic was, I guess, what you could call beggar thy neighbor policies by individual European countries, which had the effect of actually, to some extent, making the pandemic worse than it would otherwise be. So, for example, I think it's extremely important that European countries, and I guess the same goes in a transatlantic sense, but certainly within Europe, I think it's really important that individual European countries get to the point where they feel able to share data about, for example, their occupancy of intensive care units and data about the progress of the pandemic in their countries. They need to share this data easily with the neighboring countries and with other countries within the European Union. So long as the data is not shared evenly around the European Union, we'll never be able to equally, quickly, promptly allocate medicines to where they're needed. In the early days of the pandemic, obviously there was the problem of the shortage of medicines, the problem of supply, particularly in, for example, ICU medicines. The only way around that problem is if we have a European perspective, not 27 different perspectives. And I think that was one of the big learnings at the beginning, certainly as a European, is the need for that openness about data to be shared among all the countries of the European Union. A second point that I'd make, which I think was really important, again in the early days of the pandemic, is the idea of regulatory flexibilities. Obviously, the pharma industry is one of the world's most regulated industries, and that regulatory environment is extremely important to the industry. It's one of the foundations of the industry, that the regulation is appropriate to the industry. However, in the situation of a pandemic, certainly in the early days, one of the things that was also important was a certain flexibility to allow us to get medicines to the patients that needed them the most quickly. And it's not only regulatory flexibility about the particular medicines and products that the industry may well be providing, but it's also flexibility, for example, in the operation between governments and companies, companies in the plural. And so again, using the example of intensive care unit medicines, the European Commission in Europe, the Antitrust Authority, explicitly allowed companies to work together more closely than they would otherwise have been able to ensure that we got medicines to the patients that most needed them as promptly as possible. And that required a flexibility in the antitrust rules, which in normal circumstances, of course, there would never be that flexibility. But in the situation of the pandemic, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, I think it was a very important flexibility, which they allowed the industry and also the generic industry with the innovative industry to work together to get access to our medicines more quickly than might otherwise have been the case. So those are two areas that I would focus on: the data, the need for that data to flow freely within Europe and among European countries, and secondly, the regulatory flexibilities.
So David, let me follow up with you on that, especially on the data sharing. So, obviously privacy concerns, things like that, but tell me what you think is a barrier that we have with data sharing, and how could we surmount it?
It's a very good question, Donna. However, it's not the usual kind of data privacy issue that I'm drawing attention to. It's the tendency of European healthcare systems to keep the data to themselves, particularly as a pandemic is evolving, because they don't want to share the details with their neighbors about the progress of the pandemic, because of course everybody is seeking to get the supplies that they need to address their citizens, which is after all the role of government. And so it actually makes life more difficult for the industry to provide if governments are jealous about keeping their data about the hospitalizations, for example, to themselves. So it's not the usual kind of data privacy concern that I'm drawing attention to. It's more to do with the epidemiological and healthcare data, which is used by governments to manage supply in hospitals and in regions in their countries. If that could be shared better, for example, through the European Centre for Disease Control, with the European Medicines Agency, and indeed with the European Commission, then it would have allowed the allocation of medicines and other products more quickly in the early days of the pandemic. It's not really a point about privacy and about access to data in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Terry, how would you weigh in on lessons learned from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're in this unique position, right, where we all found ourselves as people that are waiting on the next big innovation for us to continue to live our lives. And it's a situation that patients with a lot of diseases have felt, leading up to this time. So what is our answer and response to this? And I think when we look both at our domestic and our global policy, if our focus is not on removing barriers to innovation and encouraging policies that will actually strengthen our healthcare systems, give greater guidance to patients, increase our ability to respond, then it's really not worth our effort, right? Removing things like tariffs and encouraging regulatory bodies to work together. We have a lot of vulnerable patients, a lot of medically vulnerable people who are still now living in this time where we're not, this isn't a post-pandemic era right now. This is one where we're very much still dealing with it. And we want to prepare ourselves and equip people, to live in what is our, reality, that these are the types of issues that are going to affect us, domestically, globally. So, if you're an oncology patient, if you're, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, you may be taking a medicine that affects your ability to be vaccinated. This is the type of focus, health policy should take to give guidance to these patients and how they continue their lives, continue their treatments, and continue to live during the pandemic and this, the time that we live in now, where we certainly saw the industry meet the call that governments put out there to, provide vaccines, therapies, pharmaceutical inputs to really help us recover economically and, cover from a healthcare perspective.
Yeah, I think the innovation, is a very important angle. We saw such tremendous creativity among a lot of companies in the healthcare industry. What are some of the ways that you think that we could continue to see that innovation, even as we do emerge, or if we do emerge from the pandemic? Terry, is that something that you would like to take? And then Michaela?
Absolutely. So, obviously this was something that it wasn't, one company. It was, as an industry, this is really the work of the pharmaceutical industry, right? Constantly trying to do the type of research and development that is going to answer the call of patients to give them treatments and therapies. So we now, in every corner of the world are looking at revisions to policies for innovation. You have pharmaceutical legislation in Europe, you have healthcare reform in the United States, and these are opportunities to, encourage research and development, encourage innovative medicines. And so the sharing of data, increasing our capabilities for telemedicine, removing tariffs on pharmaceutical components like we do finished pharmaceutical medicines. These are the types of things that will continue to have those incentives. And, some of the policies, I know that, there's an effort, right, to respond and to constantly be looking for new ways to share and increase access, which is a noble cause, but the solution really has to fit the problem here, right? So we've seen, intellectual property waivers, forced tech transfers, things like that are being proposed, and they're not really meeting the need of where we go to looking towards the future and knowing that this will not be our last health crisis. It's something that is incumbent on the industry to continue the progress that we make in, medical health and technology.
Okay, great. Michaela.
Yeah, and I wanted to just chime in too. For us, we are very much supportive. Maybe stepping back, every country after the pandemic, and as Terry said, we are still in the middle of it. But after it started, everybody started looking at what can we do to encourage this industry, right? There is this recognition of the importance, and maybe that some things were left behind in the past that now we are kind of starting to see as problematic. One of the things that we support is the U.S. Innovation Competition Act, right? It provides additional funding for a number of industry, but it's semiconductor or medtech industry. We are seeing similar incentives kind of popping around the world. And every time I talk to foreign officials, and I know there is a number of them in the audience, asking, what is it that you as a company look at as you start to expand manufacturing? And I just wanted to share that with you. When we talk to our strategy people, they say they look at, is it a stable and competitive tax market? Is it politically stable environment? What are the number of free trade agreements the country has? It's always on top of the list. That talks back to what Terry was talking about. How many tariffs will we have to pay as we move the products from one country to another? We also look at the educated workforce, ability to move people in and out for training. So what is the immigration policy? Are we able to move people fairly quickly in and out? So those are the areas that we look at. And also going back to some of the regulatory issues, we are seeing, or we've seen during the pandemic, how the ability to expedite the FDA approval or regulatory approval in many countries has been a lifesaver for all of us. And there was no corners cut. So we know that there is some inefficiencies in all of these systems that take so long. And I wanted to point out we have an issue right now in the EU. Many of you may know that a few years ago, the EU has passed the EU Medical Device Regulation, which is fantastic. We support it. It has stringent requirements, but we are supportive of it. But currently there is, because of increased scrutiny and recertification of all of the old products on top of the new ones, there's just a huge lack of notified bodies being able to approve these products. And unless that capacity increases, we may be seeing actually products that have been on the market for a number of years disappearing from the market because they will not be recertified on time. So this is kind of a whole industry issue that we now face, and I feel needs to be looked at, right? You're talking about attracting innovation, but going back to Terry's point, there's a number of diseases aside from COVID, a number of medical devices and pharma products that need to stay on the market. So just being able to have that regulatory capacity is incredibly important. So I'll just end there. I know David, I think, would like to chime in as well.
Okay, David, innovation.
Yeah, very much follow up from Michaela again. Clearly, we need a Europe that's fit for future innovation so that we can respond to unmet health needs and ensure that patients have access to innovative treatments that they require. And one of the things that Europe is about to start working on, of course, is the review of the entire legislative corpus, the entire legislative package that applies to the pharmaceutical industry. And this is known as the Pharma Review, and it's following on from the Pharma Strategy of earlier this year. And it will mean everything to do with the regulation of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe will be reviewed in European law. I think one of the really, really important points to make is that the need to set framework conditions that will attract R&D investments to Europe and sustain that competitiveness and an innovative industry are really important. And the three framework conditions, as I call them, that I would draw attention to is the need for very strong incentives for research and development, which obviously usually means IP protection. But it's not only IP protection, it's other incentives which encourage the industry to innovate and to be competitive. Secondly, I think it's really important to mention it again, the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework needs to allow for timely and effective authorization of groundbreaking therapies, including for advanced therapies, ultra-rare diseases, precision medicine, etc. So a really good future-proof regulatory framework is a really important framework condition for innovation. And thirdly, we need to think about pricing. The pricing of products in Europe really does need to be based on value, a value-based market access environment where pricing and reimbursement of innovation is based on the value that therapies bring is really, really important for patients, for healthcare systems, and ultimately for society. And so if we get those framework conditions right, then we'll have the kind of Europe that is fit for innovation, I think. And so I think we're looking at the Pharma Review, which is about to happen and about to start in Europe. I think those are three very important conditions that we in the industry need to keep in mind when assessing the kind of reforms that will be introduced.
Okay. I'd like to move on to some talk about telemedicine and digital innovation. There's definitely been an explosion of digital health and connectivity, data exchanges between the US and the EU, collaboration on clinical trials. As we move beyond COVID, how do you think those digital innovations will evolve? Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to start us off here. So obviously not every therapy, and I think, providers and doctors around the world would agree with this, not everything can be done in our homes through telemedicine. But there's a significant amount of work that can be done there. And to the extent that we can expand on the successes that we had and learn from the pandemic to build a network that is more resilient, that allows for patients to receive care in their own homes, it definitely is going to sort of put us not just in a better space vis-a-vis the pandemic, but in delivering healthcare to more people. One of the things that we've seen, and any oncology advocacy organization could tell you, is that people have really not been going to the doctor the way that they were prior to the pandemic. And so we have sort of a next wave health crisis on our hands in that, oncologists are seeing patients that are further along in disease than they had been before. And, the system is sort of trying to work to see how to best address these patients. And that's a type of therapy that's going to be, it's going to be a combination. We're never going to replace people actually physically going to hospitals and seeking treatments from doctors. But it's definitely something where we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that general care, people with other, therapeutic needs besides COVID, need to have a continuity of treatment in a world that, seems largely uncertain at the moment about our ability to, move either, globally or even domestically to seek the therapy that we want and need. So I think definitely, telemedicine is a place where we need to increase our efforts. I know that, this is part of the regulatory flexibility that we also saw, with allowing more of these services to be provided, and something we really do need to continue moving forward. And in terms of data, I think this is a challenge. Can digital technologies help us with diagnosis remotely? Can they help us track patient experiences? I think these are, again, things we have to build on for the future, because, this will not be the last time that we are facing, a pandemic, and we should certainly be more prepared for the next instance than we were this time around, and to, better cope with where we live right now, with still dealing with the sort of both the economic and, people ramifications of having just, we're in year 2 of a global pandemic.
Yeah. So, did anyone? Oh, okay. Michaela, you want to comment as well on that?
I don't have to, but I'm happy to. Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity, right? I think it's been a long time coming. I think we should have done this a long time ago, and sometimes it takes a crisis to do that. And I think, we should continue with some of this telemedicine or remote monitoring. I think one thing I'd like to point out is the importance of data flows. And I know some countries have adopted or are looking at data localization measures. And that's something that is always problematic. So just being able to move the data as needed, obviously, following all the privacy needs as necessary. But that is also important, right? As we look at some of these issues are not just pharma issues, but are also, or medtech issues, but also privacy issues. So we watch all of those streams very closely. But yes, this is a great opportunity for all of us to take advantage of as much telemedicine as possible. And we have tested it, it works, right? All of us have been to the doctor virtually, and it works just as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you both for answering that. David, did you want to chime in as well?
Just a small caveat, I suppose, that we must never forget the people that aren't digital. And, our parents can't manage it often. So we do need to take that into account. And also, let's not ride roughshod over privacy. We always need to remember that privacy is important. The challenge is to get the right regulation and the right management of that privacy to maximize the interest of patients. So I just enter those two caveats. Let's not forget about privacy, and let's forget about the people that don't do telemedicine. And there are many millions of people in our societies who don't have the capacity to do Zoom consultations with their doctor.
So as we were just talking about, we are still in a pandemic, but as Terry mentioned, it's probably not our last. And I think we should talk a little bit about preparation for the next one. Anyone have any thoughts on what we need to be thinking about as we anticipate possibly the next virus?
I'm happy to go first. Let's wade in there. I think, and again, I'll look at it first of all from a European perspective, and then perhaps Michaela and Terry can look at it more from the transatlantic perspective. But in a European perspective, one of the things that's massively important, and in fact has been discussed by 27 health ministers today in Brussels, is the creation of HERA, the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, which is the beginnings of a real European BARDA, for want of a better description. But I think this is extremely important and would make Europe much better prepared for the future and for future health threats. And it's really important that HERA is created in cooperation with the private sector and not with the private sector excluded from it. I think if HERA can cooperate and collaborate with with industry, I think it will be a much better authority in the future. Related to that, of course, is the whole concept of public-private partnership. I think one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic, as the industry rose to the challenge, is the increasing focus on public-private partnership between industry and governments in Europe. And I think this is extremely welcome and extremely important. And finally, a third point I would raise is the role not of big companies such as the ones that we work for, but the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in biotech and in the life sciences. And these smaller and medium-sized enterprises and companies need to be supported. We need European-level life science funding, backed up, for example, by the European Investment Bank, to provide the kind of funding that's necessary for the innovations of tomorrow.
So going back a second to David, to the public-private partnership issue, you of course mentioned that industry needs a seat at the table. What does industry bring? Why must they be included in this?
Industry brings knowledge, brings innovation, brings capacity, brings people, brings creativity. Industry also often brings a knowledge of what's happening on the ground, more than governments possess. I think one of the things about the whole vaccine story of the last 20 months is the massively important role of industry working with government to make life-saving vaccines available to our citizens across Europe. And I think that has been really, really important, and has shown how the value of governments working together with the private sector can really be really synergetic and have an exponential impact, much greater than the two working separately could have.
Thank you. Michaela, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, sure. So I think one issue that we haven't mentioned is the stockpiling, right? It's something that is important for governments to determine what is the level of certain goods that they need to have stockpiled. So if there is not a surge, they're able to bridge that surge until they're able to manufacture more, whether it's medicines, vaccines, PPE or ventilators, right? That's something that I think we would have fared better if we were better prepared. And I think it goes back to another area of the supply chain resiliency, right? How can we talk now in advance that we know this is going to happen again, and there is going to be perhaps shortages of chips or plastics or, resin, that we as a healthcare industry are positioned in a such way that we have access to some of these chips first. So we don't have to wait on gaming consoles, and I don't want to pick on that industry, but whatever is not as necessary to go first, because they have just giant volumes, and the healthcare industry can step in and not face enormous delays or inability to actually get some of these chips, or facing hoarding from other companies. So I think discussion now between governments on how to prevent it, how to prepare for it now, would be extremely helpful. Yeah, I think, and again, we talk about the regulatory approvals, making sure that the system is ready, is well staffed, is well funded, and is prepared to really approve some of these products efficiently, right? Nobody's asking for shortcuts, but you don't want to have staffing shortages that it's delaying products that could be on the market tomorrow, right?
So going back a second, Michaela, to the notion of stockpiling and making sure that governments are, giving priority to healthcare and making sure they have things stockpiled. How do you account for the less affluent, less developed countries, making sure that they have fair access and are, obviously it's going to be wealthy countries, developed countries are going to be able to create these stockpiles more easily than some of our developing countries. Any thoughts there on how to get around that?
I think that, we're talking about governments again preparing together. So capacity building, talking to the other governments and how we can help them. We don't make products that are ventilators or PPEs or that were used during the pandemic. But I think from what I understand from my colleagues from other industry, other companies, they are always willing to talk to governments on how to help them prepare, how to get there. And I think that goes back to the private public partnerships. I think the industry is always willing to help in any way, but I think working with developing countries, I think developed countries and developing countries together, I think the solution can be always found. But it is going to be challenged, right? The divide is always going to be there. So it's tricky, but I think this is a lesson learned where the countries can talk together and figure out the best way to help the developing countries, which we've seen with callbacks, right?
Okay. All right.
Terry,
Terry, I see you
I'd
nodding.
like to add to Michaela's comment there. So I think the thing about stockpiling, right, is that not all types of medicines really lend themselves to stockpiling, because of the sensitivity of their storage and the, how long and how cold and so I think it's incumbent on countries, to have the capacity to manufacture vaccines, because just the creation of a manufacturing site that's capable of producing products that can be injected, it takes a long time, and it's not something that can be done quickly in a crisis. So I think that's probably one of the lessons that countries have learned who don't have vaccine manufacturing capacity within that country. And again, this is likely going to be from industry and governments, working together to create that capacity in the low and middle income countries. The other thing that I would argue, going back to your question about what else needs to be done for us to be prepared for the next crisis, is that there's been a lot of work going on for years now to encourage the development of new antibiotics. Antimicrobial resistance is something that we all need to sort of set the stage for the future on, and definitely another focus that is already in the sight of industry and something that companies are cooperating together to fund research on, but something I think government should also be thinking of is an important place where they need to invest and seek out partnerships with industry.
David, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier intellectual property rights are so important, and I feel that we're about to start the TRIPS discussion. But before we get into the TRIPS discussion itself, I think I'd just mention, and again looking at this from the perspective of Merck MSD, I think it's really important, particularly in a pandemic, to look at more creative and go in more creative directions and look at things that we may not necessarily have done so quickly before the pandemic. And I'm referring to the voluntary licensing approach and working with the medicines patent pool, as you probably know, in the case of one of the Merck products, we've had very fruitful discussions with the medicines patent pool, and we've voluntarily licensed this product with a number of Indian generic companies. And I think this has been a really, really important step forward in making sure that there is access to these really important this really important product very early in its life cycle, much earlier than would normally have been the case. And so that kind of creative approach to policy and the link between policy and the commercial environment, I think, has been really important to draw attention to during the pandemic.
Okay, well, I can't believe how quickly our time has gone. We only have about less than 10 minutes. That's because you're all so interesting. So let me just throw out a quick question about the World Trade Organization and the Trade and Health Initiative. What should be the priorities there? Anyone?
Go on, sorry, Michaela.
Yeah, we all end up talking anyway, so it's we have a good panel of talkers here. No, it's important. I think we are all supportive of more trade, and I think this is a great initiative, whether it comes to tariffs or transparency. For medical devices, there is only a few countries where we face substantial tariffs, but it's important, right? And another area, I mentioned transparency. Personally, I'd like to see the initiative going a little bit beyond, and also look at expanding the WTO government procurement agreement. I talked about it earlier. There's a tendency of countries to put restrictions in, whether it's Buy American, or I know the EU is looking at the international procurement instrument. And I think expanding that GPA would be a great step for all of us to ensuring that we don't see any barriers to sell to governments, right? In our case, majority of our sales in Europe, where the public healthcare systems fall under procurement. So this is an important area that I think we should be looking at in addition to that Trade and Health Initiative. But tariffs and transparency, and again, talking about supply chains and how we can help industry during the pandemic, how the regulators can talk to the extent the WTO can facilitate some of these discussions would be very helpful.
Terry, is there anything you'd like to weigh in on?
Yeah, I obviously I agree with everything that Mihaela just laid out. I referenced it earlier. I know that the concept of waiving intellectual property rights or forcing tech transfer have been sort of a hot topic of discussion. And I would say again, I think we need to focus health policy on innovation, on access for patients, and when industry is meeting that call, they're having these conversations, they're entering into the types of agreements that David just outlined. This isn't the sort of direction in terms of global health policy that we need to be taking. It's not going to prepare us for next time, and it's certainly not going to assist us this time where we saw problems was manufacturing capacity, and the ability to gain supply, to move products, both pharmaceuticals and inputs freely from country to country. Those are the focus. We should be making it easier for industry to do the job of industry. This is the mission on a larger scale, but the one that has always been the mission of the pharmaceutical industry, which is to bring health solutions to patients that are desperately waiting for that next innovation to treat them.
Okay. And David, do you have a...
No, I think that's exactly right. As Terry said, we've got the agreements that we need. We've got the TRIPS agreement, and within the TRIPS agreement, there are ways that we can make sure that patients all over the world have access. There's no need for revolutionary change. What we need to do is to be creative and find the ways within the TRIPS agreement, which is exactly what the approach which has been taken by the Europeans, generally speaking. And I think that's the right approach.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes left, and so I'm going to let you all have the last word here. You each get about a minute. And so my question to you is, what haven't I asked you that you think is a really important thing that you want the folks watching us today to take away from this discussion? And so I am going to throw the lightning round to Mihaela because she's smiling so brightly.
I would just say, I think Terry mentioned earlier, and David too, it's about the patient. I'm going to go back to what I started with. Before the pandemic, we did not appreciate the importance of having resilient and efficient healthcare systems. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to take a fresh look and see where we can help, where we can improve, where there is barriers, where there's unnecessary barriers, where there's unnecessarily red tape, and how can we help get the latest innovation, the best innovation to the patients. It's all about not just patients. I think sometimes when we talk patients, it's so we don't connect to it. But when you talk about it, it's about your mom, about your dad, about your kids. How do we get the best innovation to your family in an efficient and safe way? So these are the things that we've covered it. Regulatory, the supply chain conversations between countries, extremely important. Getting rid of tariffs, having better cooperation overall. Countries can look at their incentives. Are we providing the R&D that is needed for some of these devices? Again, we as a company make our revenue is $10 billion. 1/10 of our revenue goes to R&D. Our industries are just so heavily R&D heavy. So that's something that we are always looking at, and how you can support this industry to help bring healthcare to the patients. So thank you.
David, what's your last word?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think I'll probably say exactly the same as Mihaela, but in a slightly different way. I think if Europe is to become resilient from future crises and to contribute to the economic growth that we want and the workforce that we want, we have to bring together the different pieces. That's the healthcare part, the pharmaceutical policy part, but also the industrial strategy. And those pieces need to work together hand in hand. Earlier, somebody mentioned AMR, and antimicrobial resistance is the perfect example of a market failure. We're only going to address antimicrobial resistance if we bring together the different pieces as I've expressed them, the healthcare part, the pharmaceutical strategy part, which will promote the innovation which is necessary to address antimicrobial resistance, but also the industrial strategies part, where we're supporting companies and the private sector to do the research, to do the innovation, which will bring to the market the antimicrobials that we need in the future to attack and to manage antimicrobial resistance. So it's bringing together the different pieces of the cake in a coherent whole, the health, the pharmaceuticals, and the industrial strategy part, which is really, really important, I think.
Okay, and Terry, last word.
So I would say as the last word, we have spent, the past 2 years doing things that we never thought we possibly could do and achieving a lot of advancement in science and policy that we thought we weren't capable of, and we obviously have been. And my last word would be that we are not mission complete, that we need to continue to focus on access for patients, improving global health, continuing to have health authorities communicate to the most medically vulnerable amongst us how they can best be treated and be vaccinated, and to continue to help everyone get back to the doctor and sort of restore what we once had and build upon it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Terry, Michaela, and David. I am so grateful for your participation today in this really, truly informative and exciting panel. And thank you all for joining us and watching us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, Donna, and to all of our speakers for such a great discussion on the importance of learning the right lessons from the COVID crisis and highlighting the importance of investing in resilient and effective health systems. As we all understand far too well these days, we cannot have a well-functioning economy without first securing our public health. I'd also like to specifically thank both Ambassador Tai and Commission Executive Vice President Vestager for joining us today. As they both made clear, there are myriad opportunities for transatlantic collaboration and the potential for serious and significant consequences if we are unable to work together effectively. Both of them also identified specific areas where there are clear challenges for the transatlantic relationship. We should be clear-eyed about these and confront them diligently. What we should certainly not do, however, is retreat back into our silos, simply move forward without active and earnest efforts to bridge those divides. If we can possibly avoid it, let's not fall back into the trap of ever-escalating trade disputes. We also had a great discussion about the supply chain challenges currently afflicting the global economy and discussed some possible avenues to solving those problems. One thing is clear. Transatlantic cooperation will be key if we are to avoid dangerous and duplicative subsidy races, to push back against those protectionist voices who naively insist that we could isolate ourselves from the global economy, and to ensure that we continue to have access to the critical things that we all need, like health products, semiconductors, and batteries for electric vehicles, among others. The discussions also focused on addressing our shared challenges from non-market economies like China. Those were particularly relevant and important. It's increasingly clear that there is a slow but sure meeting of the minds on both sides of the Atlantic on the need to do something in response to the clear threat to our way of life and our market economies that autocratic regimes represent. What's needed now more than ever is for business and government to work effectively together to identify practical and implementable solutions to address these issues together as quickly as possible. One thing is sure, the US Chamber will be working hard to advance these shared policy objectives. As everyone in the audience also knows, we won't be afraid to call out actions, whether in the US or the EU, which threaten to undermine our ability to work together. Whether that's discriminatory aspects of the European digital agenda, exclusionary terms of US procurement policy, we'll continue to call out bad ideas wherever we see them. Because we need to use this moment to achieve real and lasting improvements to the transatlantic economic relationship. And any energy spent advocating for policies that drive us apart is time that we cannot afford to waste. With that, I'd like to once again thank our sponsors, Amazon, Bayer, Citi, Google, Microsoft, and UPS for making this event possible. I also want to sincerely thank all of our colleagues from the Chamber's events, production, and AV teams for literally making this event possible and for making it run so smoothly. Clearly, we couldn't have done any of this without all of you. And finally, let me earnestly say that I hope we are able to have this conference again next year in person. And finally, with that, I'd like to wish everyone a very happy and healthy holiday season. And thanks so much for joining us for this summit.